Story 1. Hi everyone, I've been reading a lot of your skinwalker experiences, and since I'm a paranormal investigator who actually goes out in the field searching for these creatures, I decided to share my own encounter with what we strongly believe was a skinwalker, and later, a Bigfoot. I have some friends near Shiprock, New Mexico that are big into researching about Bigfoot and skinwalker sightings. They have been featured on shows like Finding Bigfoot, Coast to Coast AM, countless podcasts that speak about the paranormal, and on several History Channel programs. These people are the real deal. A few years ago, my wife and I were on vacation, and part of our trip would be driving through their town. Taking advantage of this opportunity, we decided to spend a few nights out there and hang out with them. We met up and went to dinner, and talked about our paranormal experiences and recent Bigfoot or skinwalker sightings. I wanted to experience searching skinwalker evidence for myself, so during the course of our conversation, I asked if they would be willing to take me out on the field the following night and search for these elusive creatures. Being that most of them are Native American, they were very hesitant, and only one of them agreed to it. The rest of the group decided to meet us on their last night there. The following day, my friend arrived to the hotel and picked me up around 5 p.m. We must have driven about an hour and a half out of town, mostly through dirt roads, to a place known locally to have lots of skinwalker activity. By the time we reached the location, everything was dark. He shuts the truck off, and like in most paranormal investigations, we sit and wait, trying to listen for anything out of the ordinary. For the most part, it was quiet. Other than a bunch of annoying crickets making noise, nothing much was happening. My buddy told me about recent sightings and his own encounters with these medicine men. Long story short, after about an hour, he told me to get out of the truck, walk outside, and towards the front of it to try to listen out for anything. He said that if anything happened, he would immediately turn the lights back on the truck and light up whatever might be there. Basically, he wanted me to be human skinwalker bait. I was hesitant for a moment, but since I had a weapon on me, I thought it would be okay. But I also knew that bullets would do nothing to a skinwalker unless they were blessed and have a specific type of white powder on them. Mine didn't. Just as I had made the decision to get out of his truck, the night turned even darker. This wasn't a regular dark night type of dark. This darkness had purpose to it. It felt extremely ominous. It also got extremely cold, and we both noticed that all the little critters had gone quiet. After hesitating for a while, I decided to open the truck door to get out. But as I did, and had my foot ready to touch the ground, we heard a loud whistle. It wasn't a distant whistle, like the air brings towards you. This was next to us. It sounded like it was inside the cab of the truck. Obviously, I thought someone had snuck up on us, or that my buddy was trying to f with me. But when I looked at him, he had turned completely white. The expression on his face had totally changed. Seeing him that afraid naturally had me on high alert, and I tried to snap him out of it. He seemed frozen in place. The whistling continued a couple of times, and I was screaming at my friend at this point. Eventually he came to his senses and began to react to what was happening around us. He then immediately turned his truck on. We grabbed our flashlights and looked all over the place to see what the f was out there. But of course we found no one. Feeling nervous and him being native, we decided to leave the place right away. The next day, him and a few other friends picked me up again and took me out at night to search for Bigfoot out near Shiprock Mountain. While investigating, we found what's known in the field as Bigfoot Nest. Inside of the nest were tons of dried out eaten animal carcasses and bones, mostly deer. As we were trying to figure out what lived there, we suddenly heard a loud Bigfoot yelp. It wasn't a coyote or mountain lion type of yelp. This yelp was felt in your bones. You could literally feel the vibration in your chest. Of course, we all started searching around to see what the fuck it was. I didn't see anything, but two of my partners saw something moving up on the ridge. They were scared enough to draw and cock their weapons. About 10 minutes later, we began to hear several footsteps all around us. We couldn't see who or what it was because it was really dark. even with our flashlights turned on. After hearing his footsteps getting closer and less afraid of us, we ended up leaving there as soon as we could. These are my personal experience and are 100% true. I don't expect anyone to believe me. My late friend JC Johnson and I had talked many times about what had happened. I'm still in contact with everyone who took me out those nights, and I still go out on the field here in Nevada following skinwalker, Bigfoot and ghost sighting leads that you can see on my YouTube channel. The YouTube channel for the person who posted this story is Seeking Legends. I'll include a link in the video description. Story 2. This happened to me and a group of friends during the summer of 2019. I'm not a great writer, and my memory of the events might be hazy, so I don't know if I can do this story justice because it was actually pretty terrifying for me at least. Also, I don't know if this is even paranormal, but I've never had an experience like this before in my life, and it's made me reconsider what I think when I hear other people's experiences and stories, as I never used to believe. Last year, I started hanging out with a few friends I went to high school with, playing Smash, eating pizza and the like. We usually would get together around 10:30 p.m, as most of us work during the day because we don't have classes during the summer. One night we decided to go to the nearby park, probably around midnight, to run around and whatnot, as teenagers do. And they told me that sometimes they would see what they thought was a homeless guy hanging around the park or in the woods around the park, but they never got too close to him. They would jokingly refer to him as the sludge walker, because that's the sound the wet ground would make when walking around the park at night. The first time I go with 2 other people. I'll call them Mark and John. Mark is my close friend who I've known for a long time, and the only one I was really familiar with in this group. He knows I'm kind of afraid of the dark, and jokes about how creepy the sludge walker is. At this point I have no reason to be afraid, so I laugh it off, as him screwing with me. We get to the park and sit at the pavilion, run around the soccer fields, talking etc. Eventually we run around the woods and meet back at the pavilion. After a couple of minutes, Mark flips and tells us to start running. We do so, thinking the cops are coming as they sometimes patrol the park at night. When we were out of the park, Mark says he saw something coming out of the woods, and it looked like a really tall dude. I call bullshit and think he's just screwing with me and trying to give us a cool story to tell the rest of the friends in that group. Fast forward a few weeks or so, they convinced me to go back to the park. This time we intended to look for the sludge walker and see who or what it is. This time there were 4 of us, and we split into 2 groups. We decided to go Mark and John, Paul and I. Paul was like me in that neither of us used to believe in the paranormal or cryptids or anything like that. We were walking onto a path in the woods that surrounds the park, and we hear a few twigs snap. I say it's probably a deer or some shit, and we continue on. All of a sudden, something drops down from the tree canopy and scares the shit out of us. It was a bat. Go figure. But as we continue into the woods further, Paul stops me and says to listen. We hear some leaves rustling behind us, and I reach to get my flashlight out. I don't see what's in front of us, but Paul does. As I'm fumbling with my phone trying to get the flashlight, Paul hits the deck, so I do as well. Then we hear something running up the path away from us. The footsteps were fast and sounded very heavy. I am freaking out at this point because I thought we were going to get mugged by some guy who was catching some Zeds in the woods. It doesn't come back, and we call the other group of people and hightail it out of the park. Paul says he saw the thing, and it looked really tall with a hunched back and really long fingers. Again, I call bullshit, because that's every scary monster troop mixed into one, and I brush it off as a homeless guy again. A few days later, and we're all hanging out again. They say we should return into the woods and check it out. I disagree because I don't want to come across the homeless guy again. Again, I give in to peer pressure and my own curiosity and end up going with them. This time we all stick together and are making our way through the woods, and then we hear it. As if from every creature horror movie you've ever seen, Everything is dead silent when suddenly this screeching erupts from the path behind us, and we all book it as fast as we can out into the open. We are all freaked out, but Mark and John decide to run back into the woods and get a recording of this thing. They took a video, even though it was dark and you can't see anything, but you can sure hear it. I am freaked out, and none of us can figure out what this is. My sister hypothesized that it could be a fox screaming, as they make a sound kind of like that. But we think this sound is polyphonic, 2 pitches at once, so we're all stumped. You know the drill by now. Mark, John and I are hanging out again, and it's raining. I want to go back this time as I want to get to the bottom of this. Finally, the rain lets up about 3 a.m, and we suit up for a muddy trek and head out. Probably the worst mistake I could make, as what happened next I still can't wrap my head around, and as a result, I still can't sleep in complete darkness. We're in the park, and almost immediately we see someone very tall walking out from under the pavilion. He or it is coming right at us, as the light from the pavilion illuminates the figure walking towards us. We run behind some tall bushes as I speculate that it could be a cop or park ranger coming to bust us for trespassing. We then decide to take a peek and creep along the edge of these tall bushes. When we round the corner, we see it, standing fully upright, just a few feet in front of us. I didn't really get a good look at it, but I saw really long fingers and some sort of cloth draped over its body, and it was at least 7 feet tall. We all start running, and me being a total wuss start actually screaming. I don't think I ever ran faster in my entire life. I looked back a few times to see if it was following, and it was just walking along the bush line. I also noticed it had multiple glowing eyes that were glowing a faint red colour, which was the only way I could tell where it was. My adrenaline was going so hard I couldn't tell if it was making a noise or not. I've never gone back, and I don't intend to. I sometimes think that it was a homeless guy or someone who lives by the park screwing with us because I don't really believe in the paranormal. But this is something I really can't explain any other way. Mark theorized that it could be a skinwalker or a wendigo from urban legends. When I tell people about this, I usually leave out the part about the glowing eyes, as it just sounds stupid and crazy. But that's the part that keeps me from believing that it's just some random guy. Everyone wants to have a weird or paranormal experience, but when you actually do, it sticks with you and can really mess with your head in the long term. And in my case, it makes a 20-year-old sleep with a nightlight. If you actually read this and you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. This is my first Reddit post, so I'll do my best to get back to you. Before I continue to the next story, I just want to say thank you for selecting to watch this video, and I hope you're enjoying my narration. If you like my storytelling, please show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It really does help me out. Thank you. Story 3. Well, after all my years of supernatural encounters, I'm finally making a Reddit account to post my stories. This is my most recent Wendigo encounter in DeWitt County, Texas. January 12th, 2019. Around 8 p.m. Now, I'm going to be honest, I chose to go out on this particular night because my town was having a little ghost tour at the haunted hospital. I was lonely and wanted to at least see others having fun. It was 8 p.m. when I left the house and planned to be back within an hour. I have a routine of circling my town in the evening because I just like patrolling and there's always things creeping about after nightfall. I made my way to the haunted hospital, and once I got there I saw flashlights inside the windows and heard laughter. That's nice, I thought. Seeing others have fun made me smile and got rid of some of the loneliness I was feeling. This was the halfway point of my walk, and I started my second half heading home now. There were some woods on the opposite side of town now, but nothing impressive until I got to the last quarter of my walk. Now, I was passing the baseball field on my left with a large wheat field on my right. This wheat field used to be a large extension of the woods, but was cleared out for growing wheat. I continued again and crossed the small bridge that went over a creek and past another section of the woods. I was now headed towards an old metal building that has recently been turned into a place for making gates and fences. It was about 9 p.m. now. This building had 2 small white houses beside it and a stretch of dirt road wrapping around the back side of it before returning to a normal asphalt road. Now, at night this place seems pretty scary, but this was one of my favourite places to hang out at night, and is a normal path I take my walks through. As I was coming up to the dirt road, I saw a very tall, 8 to 10 foot pale figure with lanky arms almost dragging the ground about 40 feet ahead of me, briskly walk from the white houses to the woods. I stopped walking. What is that? I thought. Its size confused me so much that I had forgotten my previous encounters with a smaller version of it. After a few minutes of standing there, I convinced myself to continue walking forward. I mean, I was an adventurous person, and there's no way I was just going to turn tail and go home when I just saw something so odd and out of place. Not even 15 seconds into walking forward, this sudden heavy sense of dread overcame me like a giant weight crashing down on my shoulders. My instincts were telling me something was really wrong. I turned my iPhone light on and shined it at the woods. Nothing. I kept walking while keeping my head on a swivel, looking in all directions to keep my surroundings in check. About a 5th or 6th time I looked at the woods, I saw it. A huge bleached white humanoid figure crouching on all fours. It was easily still 5 to 6 feet tall, even though it was bent over. Its black eyes paralyzed me. It had a big, round, bald head and an extremely emaciated body void of all hair, with very long, almost dislocated-looking arms and legs. Its legs were like a flamingo bird's at the knee as it bent backwards instead of forward. I took all of this in a matter of seconds. Suddenly it reminded me of a praying mantis when it swayed back and forth while staring as if deciding whether or not to attack. This broke me out of my trance and I ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I'd run a block. Out of breath and scared as heck, I finally took a glance back. I didn't see anything in sight. I didn't hear it chase me either. Maybe it was just stalking those people in those little white houses and was waiting for me to go away to go back to its business. Maybe it didn't want anything to do with me. But that wasn't the end. I got home and took a shower and turned out the lights before I hopped in bed, when suddenly there was something tapping on my window. Tap, tap, tap. 3 taps and nothing else. I laid in my bed that night wondering if it had followed me home or not. A string of bad luck ensued afterwards in the following weeks. I was constantly burning stuff on the stove that was relatively easy to make, and I was usually an excellent cook on top of that. My dog started going nuts at night, growling and barking in the living room and at the front door, which she has never done as she is the quietest, sweetest dog you'll ever meet. And then I finally got deathly sick for 3 weeks straight, with no sure sign of what I had gotten. 103 fever, vomiting, diarrhea, sneezing, coughing, sore throat, migraines, nerve spasms, stuffy and dry nose. It changed constantly. Severe stomach aches, aching all over the place, especially in my bones. Other lesser entities taking advantage of my state, trying to latch onto me. And slight insomnia. I've had similar strings of bad luck before after hearing its mimicry trying to lure me into the forest or seeing it one other time, but I didn't see any details. Nothing ever this extreme. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Story 4. This happened when I was about 7 years old to my uncle. He's no longer with us, and I want to share his story. Growing up, I lived in northern Michigan on 50,000 acres of farm and ranch land that backed up onto state land. Nothing but miles of forest and pasture could be seen. Needless to say, it made us pretty tough, and it takes a lot to spook us. We are all avid hunters, fishermen, and outdoorsmen. Being the only girl, I was raised as a tomboy, and I'm just the same. My uncle went off to join the military, becoming a senior NCO in a prominent Special Forces division of the US Navy. He was 6'4", built like a wrestler, obviously skilled in survival tactics, and nothing rattled him. He was home on leave and went out hunting as it was deer season. I remember him coming home in the house, shaking and crying, saying he saw something in the woods. He was tough as nails and would tear someone to shreds before he let them make him cry. My grandmother tried to get him to make sense, but he kept saying he saw Bigfoot mixed with a wolf. My granny immediately got my grandfather, and he rounded up the rest of the guys, hunting my dad, a few male cousins, my uncle, who was still terrified but went because he didn't want to be labelled a chicken, got all their shotguns and ammunition, and saddled the horses to go clear the woods. Apparently they were aware of the dogman, but I was blissfully young and ignorant. They told me to stay inside, and for no reason I was to step outside of our house until they returned. I had never heard my dad or my grandfather so serious, so I hid in my room. Sunset comes, and they still aren't back. I'm really worried at this point because they never stayed in the woods after dark. Shortly, I heard the sound of the horses running to the barn, and their voices. I was so relieved. They looked troubled when they came into the house, but didn't say anything, so as probably not to spook me. At dinner, my dad laid down the law. I was no longer allowed to play outside or go into the barns alone. I had to have my grandfather with me at all times. Of course, I was upset by this and felt my independence was being taken away. But I obeyed. The next morning, my dad and grandfather taught me how to shoot. So I knew it was serious. I overheard the adults talking the next night. Apparently, there were tracks where my uncle had his sighting bigger than any wolf could make, but they were definitely dog tracks. As I said before, we were avid outdoorsmen and hunters. We can identify tracks easily, but these couldn't be identified. About 8 feet up in a tree were claw marks. No Michigan bear could make those. We also found claw marks of about the same height on multiple trees throughout our property, had cattle mutilated and not in a way a coyote or bear would, and it lasted that whole winter. We lost about 30 to 40 cattle that winter, all of them mutilated, all with the same wolf or dog tracks in the snow. I really feel like this experience changed my uncle. Who knows? He did multiple tours of the Middle East for Desert Storm and OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom, before he committed suicide. After that experience, though, he was never the same. He went from not ever drinking to never seeing him without a bottle of Jack, and his eyes were always haunted. He changed his personality and never went out in the woods again. He quit hunting, and he eventually just quit coming home to visit on leave. He didn't even come home for my dad's funeral 2 years later. It was heartbreaking to see him deteriorate the way he did. I truly believe he saw something out there, and it ultimately killed him. Story 5. Once, when my family and I were living with my aunt and her family, my brother and older cousins swear they saw the Mothman. My aunt, uncle and mum were going to the store around 8 p.m. one night, and I, not wanting to be stuck in the house with my brother, male cousin and 2 male friends, went with the adults. We had been gone almost 2 hours, and when we pulled into the driveway, all 4 boys sprinted out of the house terrified. 2 of them had shotguns, and immediately our parents demanded to know what happened. This group of boys from the ages of 10 to 14 were in tears, all trying to explain at once. Eventually, we got them to calm down enough to understand what they were saying. For reference, my aunt and uncle's home is in a very rural part of town. They have a bit of woods and a creek we can see from the back porch, and there is a fire pit halfway between the porch and the creek. So anyway, the boys said they opened the sliding back door and sat with their feet hanging out because they wanted a breeze. Then my brother noticed 2 red eyes glowing in the dark. All being hunters, they weren't frightened at first, thinking it might be an animal. But when they looked harder, they knew it wasn't. It was shaped like a large man. It had casually leaned against the tree it was standing next to, and waved. The boys started to freak out, and right before 2 of them went to go get their guns, it jumped, revealed large wings that spanned the width of its arms, and flew, mere feet above the ground to stand by the fire pit. My brother said he didn't move, that he and this creature locked eyes, and he was paralyzed. By the time our cousin and their friend came back with the dual shotguns, it was gone. My brother said it was there, and in the blink of an eye, it just wasn't. They took this as a good sign and closed the back door and huddled in the living room until we got back. Now, mind you, these boys don't scare easily. They have been hunting most of their lives. They've killed deer, bears, and wild boar, pretty much any animal that could kill you 10 times over. These boys were mortified. I'm not sure if any of them even slept that night. They weren't all right for a few weeks after that. It's been almost 10 years since this happened, and to this day both my brother and our cousin won't joke about it. They get nervous any time it's brought up and demand that we please don't talk about it. Story 6. This story was written by the Reddit user Stormberry17. When I was 11 years old, my family and I went camping in New York. It was my parents and my younger brother. We'll call him Caleb. So the campsite we were at felt pretty desolate. We go camping there every year, and it's usually packed, but this time it was practically empty. The second night we were there, we were sitting at the fire, and Caleb said that he had to go to the bathroom. My mum told me to go with him, and we both got up and left. After so many years, I had memorized the way to the bathroom. You have to go through the woods for a bit before coming to a path that leads straight there. Even though I had brought a flashlight, it would only illuminate about 3 feet ahead. So Caleb and I arrive at the bathroom, and Caleb enters the boys' room. I walk into the girls' room and look around. It was the general camp bathroom, just barely cleaner than a porta potty. There are 3 stools and a single window above the sink. The only light is coming through the window from the lamp that was outside. I go into one of the stalls and do my business. While I'm in there, it suddenly goes dark. I turn on the flashlight and point it at the window. To my surprise, there's something covering it. You must understand that the window is pretty high up, so much so that I could see it from the stall where I was sitting. I was a little confused as to what could be covering it. After about a minute, whatever it was blocking it moved, and the light returned. I finish up, wash my hands, and exit the bathroom. Caleb is already waiting outside. I ask him if he saw anything by the window, and he shakes his head. I shrug, and we both start heading back to the camp. We're not even off the path when the flashlight starts to flicker. I curse under my breath and start shaking it. Then, I hear a rustling sound nearby. Caleb grabs my hand and begins to whimper. I start telling him that everything is fine, while shining the dying flashlight in the direction of the sound. Finally, I see something about 20 yards away. It's hard to make out what it was, but then it started to shamble closer. Eventually, I could see it, and I nearly dropped the flashlight in horror. This thing looked like that human-dog fusion from Full Metal Alchemist. It was on all 4s, and even then it was almost 6 feet tall. Its eyes were glowing, and I could tell it was staring right at us. At that moment, several things happened at once. The flashlight completely went out, Caleb screamed, and the creature made a noise that I don't even know how to describe. Think of it like a dog moaning, but much louder, and sounding more human? I grab Caleb and begin running back to the camp as fast as I could. When I get to the end of the path, I look behind me and scream. The creature was now chasing us, running on 2 legs. I start running blindly through the woods, desperately looking for the light of our fire, but I couldn't see anything. Caleb was crying, and I could still hear that thing crashing through the woods, still making that ear-piercing sound. I screamed for my parents, for anyone, but nobody came. Then, as suddenly as it came, the creature was just gone. I suddenly stopped hearing it, and when I finally collapsed to the ground in exhaustion, it wasn't behind us anymore. By this point, I was hyperventilating and Caleb was still crying. As I begin to catch my breath, I look around. I can barely see anything in the darkness and the flashlight was long gone. Then, I hear another sound. But it was the best sound in the world. Rachel? Caleb? It was my parents. I stand up with Caleb and begin to walk towards them. When we meet, I finally let it out. I begin sobbing and trying to explain what happened. I think they thought I was crazy. Either way, my parents bring Caleb and I back to the camp, and we sleep in the tent. Needless to say, I didn't actually get any sleep that night. The next day, it was clear to my parents that Caleb and I would not be able to cope the rest of the week. So, we left early. Since that trip, I've done research about dogman sightings. I'm not completely sure what we saw that night, but it's been 5 years since then. Caleb is so afraid of the dark now that he has panic attacks, and I'm embarrassed to admit that I have a fear of dogs. No matter what it was, this creature was very real. Thank you for watching and/or listening to this video. Again, if you enjoyed my narration, please hit that like button, and if you don't already subscribe to my channel, go ahead and subscribe. Let me know what you thought of these stories in the comments section below, and check out the links to the original posts in the video description as well. If you have a story you would like me to narrate on this channel, please email me at mrsinisterstories@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching. Story 1. Hello there. My name is Bradley. I'm somewhat of an adrenaline junkie. What I do to get this fix of adrenaline is I will go out in search of nothing in particular and just hope something happens. Sometimes I get more than I wanted. This is one of those stories with the exception that I wasn't seeking adrenaline this time. Be warned that some events in this story may be disturbing for the faint of heart. This is your warning. Continue at your own risk. The date is October 14th, 2010. I used to live on a decently sized property in the mountains of northwestern Georgia. I loved it up there. So many places to wander off and so many places to have a little hideout. It was the day before my uncle's birthday, and me and him wanted to go out to our favourite hangout spot, which we called the broccoli tree. In a nutshell, it was an old uprooted tree with a hole big enough to fit a couple of chairs and some other things where the roots had been. We did some modifications and put a tarp over it so we could stay in there if it rained. So me and my uncle were walking out to the tree, which is a good 15-minute walk from the front porch of the house. As soon as we break into the tree line, we start messing around and pushing each other playfully, without a care in the world. My uncle and I walked to the tree so many times we could find it in pitch-black darkness, so we weren't really that afraid. I sort of had this feeling that we were being watched, but I just shrugged it off a little, and we kept walking. Skip forward a little to our arrival at the tree. Nothing seemed out of place, so we went inside and sat down. We started to talk about the specific things he'd seen out hunting and things like that. Then he mentioned a skinwalker. Confused, I asked him about what it was, and he broke it down so I could understand. He said they were half man, half beast, and that they could shapeshift. I laughed at this and asked him if he'd been playing too much Diablo recently, not thinking he was serious. He looked me in the eyes with a dead serious look on his face and says he saw one while he was hunting. My excitement immediately turned to fear, as I remembered that I felt something was watching us on the way to the tree. I told him I had a feeling we were watched, and he said he'd felt it too. We start listening closely to see if we could hear anything outside the tree, but everything was silent. We both looked at each other and decided we had to leave. We emerged from the tree, and he tells me to jump on his back so he could run. I do so, and the moment I was on his back and he had a tight grip, we heard something from behind us. I go to turn around and look to see what it is, but my uncle told me not to. Then he started running to the house in almost pitch-black darkness with something chasing after us. I could hear its footfalls behind us, and heavy breathing was getting louder as if it was getting closer. I scream at my uncle, and he starts sprinting through the woods. Then the front porch light comes into view through the trees, and I say, "There it is!" My uncle trips over himself and we both catch the air. I was flung a little higher, so I landed closer to the house than he did. I looked back at him, and he screamed at me to run and not worry about him. I don't listen. I ran over to help him up when something hit me square in the chest, knocking me back. "Don't look!" my uncle screams. I wish I would have listened. I look up to see a man with a dog-like head and glowing solid white eyes. My uncle tries to scurry away from it, but it grabs him and picks him up to his feet and stares into his eyes. Then came a gunshot. The beast tosses my uncle into a tree and scurries away frightened. That's when my other uncle comes up from behind me and helps my uncle off the ground. I slowly stand up and wipe myself off and ask what that thing was. The uncle that was with me says only one word: Skinwalker. Then all three of us go back up to the house. A couple of days later, the uncle that was with me was deployed overseas to Korea for the army. We tried to forget, but we just couldn't seem to get it off of our minds. One night, I woke up at about 4 a.m. because of a dream I had of it. I rubbed my eyes and let them adjust to the low levels of light and see the two glowing eyes again, right outside my window. I grabbed the flashlight I had in my room for late-night bathroom runs and shine it at the window. Within a few seconds, the skinwalker ran away, and I have yet to see him again. To this day, both of my uncles have not spoken a word about this, and still refuse to do so. Story 2. So about 3 years ago, I was camping with my girlfriend, now ex-girlfriend, as she had always expressed interest, but had never been. The spot we went to is in the Huron National Forest and is my go-to trail and camp spot as it's hidden deep in the forest and the access to the trails is close and easy, for ATVs, etc. My family has been going to the spot for about 6 years, and my friends that introduced me about 10 or so years. We went for a weekend trip, and I'm glad we didn't go any longer. When we got there, everything was going well except we did notice a group of people that were hanging out next to our campsite, but they were just stargazing and ended up leaving. Then around midnight is when the weird stuff started to happen. At first it sounded like someone was laughing at us, but the laugh never ended and got very high-pitched and sounded as it kept going. After a while, we both got kind of scared and went into the tent to try to sleep. And that's when the laugh or noise moved up higher and then started to circle the campsite. After a while of that happening, it just suddenly stopped and then started again around 3 a.m. When it started again, the fire was going out, so I went to stoke the fire with my shotgun in hand and turned on my flashlight to see if maybe I could see coyotes or something around the campsite. But I didn't see anything, or hear any movements below. This went on until 6 a.m., and then stopped. And then finally we were able to get some rest. After we woke up, we checked around the campsite and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. So, we packed up. Once we were packed up and good to go, I go to start my vehicle, and it's completely dead. That really freaked me out as I'm always paranoid about leaving things plugged in that kill the battery and made sure everything was closed properly and unplugged. Yet somehow, the battery still died. I was able to get a jump from a AAA. That phone call was hard to explain and the lady who took the call didn't believe me, but at the end we both laughed. After that happened, I told my friend who had shown me the campsite and also has a cabin in the same forest, roughly 25 miles away from the campsite, about what happened, and he got freaked out. He told me about 2 incidents which he has had, one at the campsite and one at his cabin. At the campsite, he stated that one night after we had all returned from trail riding and went to bed, he stayed up to hang out by the fire and have a few drinks, While he was hanging out, he was just looking off into the distance and he saw a pair of eyes up in the trees looking directly at him. He described them as bioluminescent eyes. When he flashed his high-powered flashlight at them, there was nothing there. And as soon as the flashlight was turned off, they were looking right back at him. So, he packed up and went right to bed. He didn't tell us about this because he didn't want to scare us. At the cabin, he was hanging out with his brother and they were both just chilling by the fire outside when they both saw a pair of eyes looking at them from the trail that leads into the woods. They stated that at the height the eyes were looking at them, whatever it was had to be 7 foot plus tall. They started shooting at it with their rifles, and the eyes disappeared. But once they were done, they reappeared and they were closer. At that point, they both freaked out and got back into the cabin and they did not leave until daylight. We have no idea what this could have been, but all felt very scared when these events were happening. After we all talked about it, one of the brothers thinks it was a Wendigo. I don't really know what it could be, but I haven't felt that scared since. Before I continue to the next story, I just want to say I hope you're enjoying my narration, and if you like my storytelling, please show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It really helps me out. Thank you. Story 3. I have a story. It isn't mine. It happened to my uncle. He used to tell this story when we went camping and it scared the lights out of me every time I heard it. We live in Utah, and my uncle, Mark, went on a mission at 19. They sent him to an Indian reservation in Arizona. They paired him up with a companion named Carl. When they first got there, there was a huge rift with the locals on the reservations with them being there. They didn't want my uncle and Carl staying on the reservation grounds. Eventually, they came to a compromise that they would stay on the outskirts in a trailer. This reservation wasn't very big and was located to a heavily wooded area. The first night, they were trying to sleep when all of a sudden their trailer started to shake violently back and forth. Startled and not sure what was happening, they climbed under their table for cover. Mark could distinctively hear someone pushing it from both sides of the trailer, like a group of people. After about 5 minutes, it stopped. That next day they made their rounds on the reservation, and they were talking to the locals. Carl made the comment to one of the families that their trailer was shaking that night before. The family got very quiet and then told them they had to leave. They thought that was strange, but they didn't think much of it. The next night it happened again. They awoke to their trailer shaking back and forth. Again they climbed under the table until it stopped. This went on for 2 more nights. Anytime they tried to talk to anyone about it, they got quiet and told them to leave. Mark started thinking that due to the tension of their arrival, the locals were doing this to scare them off the reservation. They went into a convenience store and they were talking together about how frustrated they were with the situation. The clerk overheard and said, "They can't talk about it. It's forbidden." Confused, they ask him, "Can't talk about what?" The guy continues to tell them about skinwalkers. He says they are evil demons that were once Native American witches. If they talk about it, the skinwalkers will come for their souls. They just walked out of there baffled. They thought it was just another scare tactic. So, that night, when the shaking started again, my uncle decided to be brave and confront them. He went to the trailer door and flew it open and yelled, "Hey!" When he did that, he saw these 3 animals run off. 2 were wolves. 1 was a bear. They looked strange, almost with human features. As he watched them run towards the trees, all 3 stood up on 2 legs and walked slowly towards the trees, making a human cackling laugh. It scared him so bad that they called their mission president that next morning and asked to be moved. They were relocated that day. For a year, nothing else happened. One day, they announced that Carl was getting relocated to another city, and Mark was getting a new companion, Jimmy. They had to drive for about an hour to pick up Jimmy from the airport. The road they travel went through the boundaries of the reservation. They arrive about 8 p.m. and met Jimmy, and then they go to leave. The mission president tells Jimmy, "We are driving through a dangerous area at night, so we can't make any stops. If you need to use the restroom, you need to go now." Jimmy says, "I'm fine." The mission president gets serious enough to even freak out Mark. "I'm not kidding. Go do your business." Jimmy was insistent he was fine. So, they hit the road. They were about 30 minutes into the drive. They were going through the area of the reservation boundaries and Jimmy starts complaining that he needed to pee badly. The mission president says, "We can't stop here. You'll have to hold it." Jimmy keeps going on. "I really can't hold it." So the mission president stops the car and says, "Okay, but you will do your business next to the door. And if I say get into the car, you better get into the car fast." With a look of confusion, Jimmy says, "All right," opens the door, and starts to do his business. About 5 seconds later, the mission president says nothing and just yanks Jimmy into the car and floors it. Jimmy and Mark start freaking out. What is going on? The mission president says nothing and just increases his speed. All of a sudden, Mark sees something next to the car to his right. A giant wolf-looking man was running on 2 feet next to the car. Mark looked at the speedometer. They were going over 60 miles an hour and still increasing. The wolf-like creature kept right next to the car for 10 minutes until it finally took off into the trees. Shaking, Jimmy gets out of the car when they arrive. They didn't speak through the whole ordeal. He asks, "What did I just see?" The mission president says, "The next time I tell you to take care of your business, you take care of your business." Story 4. So I live in Arizona. Over the weekend, I went camping with my fiancée and her sister and husband. My fiancée is 4 months pregnant. We had a great time camping and fishing. I love fishing, and it's been one of the best coping mechanisms since I got out of the army. Well, Saturday afternoon we all went fishing on my soon-to-be brother-in-law's boat, had a blast and caught some fish, then headed back to camp. That night I felt like going fishing again, because fishing at night is usually a good time. But no one else wanted to go, and my fiancée was actually already in the tent getting ready to go to sleep. So I decided to go by myself and fish from the shore of the lake. This was around 10:30 p.m. Well, I was out there for a good 45 minutes with no odd interruptions, just enjoying the peace and quiet, when I hear a loud snap about 30 meters away. As a former infantryman, I've been taught to observe my surroundings and always be on my guard. This snap was odd. It wasn't like an ordinary twig snap, more like a large fallen branch. At first I'm thinking bear, as that would be the only logical explanation based on weight that could break something that large. So I'm looking in that general direction for a good 30 seconds after the snap, and hear nothing. Then it happens. I hear footsteps, followed by the most foul and oddly unique smell hitting my nose. These steps are most certainly bipedal, and I just had the strongest intuition and gut feeling it wasn't anyone of my family, but something dangerous. Like worse than what I faced overseas dangerous. The feeling of fear I felt was unrivaled at that moment. So, I say out loud, "Who's there?" But there's all of a sudden silence for a good minute. Then it happens. I see something breaking the tree line about 15 feet from the shore of the lake. It's on 4 legs, which freaked me out because the walking after the snap was definitely a 2-legged creature, and extremely pale with odd fur patches covering its body. It looked like a malnourished wolf or coyote, but with a smaller head. Like the head was half developed. We locked eyes, and again, it's like a telekinetic wave of fear washes over me. But I stood my ground. This thing then does what made me 100% sure it wasn't a normal animal. It talks. First, the most creepy laughter, almost like a child's mixed with a demon's. That's the best way I can describe it. Then it says to me while simply walking away now, "Danger. You're in danger. All of you." Followed by more laughter. I stood frozen watching it as it walked parallel to the lake until it was out of sight. I was then hit with an overwhelming feeling of dread and immediately thought to check on my fiancée and soon-to-be family members, because the feeling inside me was so strong that they were now in extreme danger too. I got back to the camp, and everyone was asleep. I didn't tell any of them what happened as not to alarm them, and I didn't expect them to believe me if I did because I wouldn't believe myself if I hadn't seen and heard it. The worst part is we have now been home for a full 24 hours, but that feeling of me and my fiancée being in danger keeps echoing in my mind. I was taught never to run or surrender and to face my enemies head on, and this feeling I have is almost like a life or death thing. Kill it and be safe, or feel like me and my fiancée are going to die for God knows how long. I have training and have dealt with enemies before. Should I go back, alone and prepared? What should I do? My fight or flight response hasn't been shut off since we've gotten home, and most of me wants to go back, prepared, and face this thing or try to find something which I doubt would be an issue based on this weird feeling I have inside of me. Honestly, everyone, what should I do? Because I can't get this creature's words or thoughts, whatever it projected onto me, out of my head, much less the words I actually heard. The following are continued updates to this post. I've been posting this on my brother's account because my fiancée knows mine and I don't want her to see this. We're about 40 minutes away, fully prepared, hopefully, and ready. My brother drove separately as he is relatively scared, and I want him to be able to leave whenever he wants, regardless if he is our cameraman or not. His safety is more important. I will update if we make it out safely, God willing. Thanks to all of you who wished me the best and gave me advice. You're all appreciated. I forgot to mention something odd happened. The day before yesterday at night, I got a notice saying strange activity had been sensed on his account, and it was locked. Had to change the password, so I did it, and told my brother. Afterwards it said it was okay, but I haven't been able to even log in until today after it randomly started working. Kind of odd, but hopefully nothing. I'm going silent until Monday, I'm guessing. God bless, guys. Final update. We finally made it out. This weekend was like an acid trip, all except a short time Sunday night when we finally encountered the thing again. My little brother left after the first day as he said all night he was hearing odd and terrifying sounds. But the weird thing is, me and Matt hadn't heard anything. We went out exploring, and all of a sudden everything was just confusion Sunday night. We had planned to leave Sunday, but agreed to stay another night because we hadn't had any success. But finally, for an amount of time, we can't really remember what we had encountered. The weirdest thing is we're missing only about 9 rounds total from our sidearms, but I don't remember firing them at all. Matt doesn't either. If anyone lives anywhere near Greer, Arizona or close to Hawley Lake, please let me know if you heard any gunshots. We were up high and far out, but still. We were technically right outside the Apache Indian Reservation. Or so we think. Story 5. This next story has been written by Iris Lamb. You can check out hers and all the other original writers' posts by clicking on the links in the video description. So this story didn't happen to me, but I heard it many times when I was growing up. My grandparents owned 80 acres about 20 miles east of Snowflake, Arizona. They had moved to the land in the early 80s after my grandfather had retired from the mine in San Manuel, Arizona. The land was pretty barren. I don't know why they chose to buy it. Red sandstone bluffs and dry washes cut across the landscape dotted with juniper and cedar trees. And red sand everywhere. I suppose at the time the land was cheap. They didn't have any close neighbours. The closest was about a mile away, which was my aunt and uncle. The next closest neighbour was a man named Stoddard. I never got his first name, just Stoddard. He lived about 4 miles from my grandparents at the base of one of the sandstone bluffs. He was an arsehole rancher, from what my grandparents said. He thought that he owned everything and was entitled to do whatever he wanted. More than once, my grandpa had caught Stoddard cutting my grandfather's barbed wire fence to let his cattle onto my grandpa's land to graze. Now, this area is full of ancient Anasazi Pueblo ruins. Most of them have been destroyed by ranchers with backhoes trying to find pots to sell. I'm sure Stoddard was one of them. So the story goes, one day after losing a calf, Stoddard stumbles upon a cave sealed by a giant slab of sandstone against one of the sides of the bluff. Curious about it, he used a backhoe to remove the boulder. After going inside, he discovers it's an Anasazi burial cave. I'm sure he was delighted. He starts taking things from the burial cave and selling them. Well, from that moment on, he has some pretty shitty luck. First, he lost about $500,000 in the stock market. Then his cattle all get a disease and die. In financial ruin, he gets another blow. His wife gets diagnosed with an extremely rare disease and dies. Then Stoddard gets thrown from his horse and loses his ability to walk. This all happens within a couple of years. He tells everyone he knows that he's cursed from the Anasazi burial. They laugh it off. Stoddard puts all the artifacts back that he still has and seals the cave back up with the boulder. He abandons all his belongings and leaves one night. This is in the late 1980s. Fast forward a couple of years since Stoddard abandoned his ranch house. The land and house are bought by a man from California. He puts the ranch house up for rent. My aunt is pregnant with her first son and decides to move from San Manuel to Snowflake to be closer to her parents. Stoddard's house is fully furnished. My aunt and her husband move in. He finds a job working nights at the local paper mill. It is very creepy out there at night. At first it seems like a nice little place. Creepy at night, but not too bad. Then weird shit starts happening. My aunt starts to hear faint chanting and drums at night. She brushes it off. She had a hippie neighbour that lived about a mile away up on the bluff, so she figures it must be them doing some hippie stuff. But she can't help but feeling like someone or something is always watching her, all the time. She starts having nightmares every night, but chalks it up to being alone and hormones. She finally tells my grandpa about it, and he loans her his dog to keep her company at night. She drives the dog out there, but he refuses to get out the truck. The hair on his back goes straight up and he starts growling. She gets freaked out, but figures maybe he saw a rabbit or something and hauls him into the house. The dog just stares at the door and growls. That night, he growls and barks all night. The drums and chanting are louder. The next morning, my aunt finds human bare feet footprints around the house. So this goes on for about a week. The dog barks and growls at night. Nightmares when she does go to sleep. Footprints in the morning. The chanting and drums keep getting louder. Finally, feeling like she's losing her mind, she asks my grandma to come over and stay the night with her. Grandma is more than happy. After finishing her chores, she heads over, planning to make my aunt a nice meal. This is the late afternoon. My aunt lays down for a nap, comfortable now that my grandma is there. My grandma decides to take a little walk at the base of the bluff. My grandma was a very religious person. She was very active in the church and devoted her life to Jesus. As she is out on her little walk, she likes to look for pottery shards or arrowheads. A little ways from the house, she gets a very unnerving feeling that something is watching her. She said it made her skin crawl. She said something evil. So my grandma prays and walks back to the house, pleading the blood of Christ. She decides not to say anything to my aunt, who is awake because she is already frightened. She tells my aunt maybe it's a better idea to stay at my grandma's house tonight. My aunt agrees. By the time my aunt gets her stuff together and the sun is about to go down behind the bluff, Grandma, Aunt, and the dog all load up in the pickup. Grandma turns the key, and nothing. She tries again, nothing. Not being very mechanically inclined, Grandma goes into the house to call Grandpa, but he doesn't answer. She remembers he was going into town that afternoon. Dang. They unload and go back into the house, waiting for Grandpa to get home. It's night now, no moon, pitch dark. The dog begins its low growl. The sounds of chanting and drums begin, faint at first, but growing louder. My grandma begins to pray in between calling Grandpa. Remember, this is a time before cell phones. They hear something howl outside. Not a coyote howl, something more ominous and terrifying. Something is moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. Both women are beyond terrified at this point. Finally, after turbo-dialing Grandpa, he finally answers. My grandma is frantic. Elvin, something is outside of the house. Get here now. For what seems like hours, they wait for Grandpa's truck to come over the hill. Finally, they see the headlights. Before Grandpa flies into the driveway, something runs across the road in front of him. His headlights illuminate an animal or something. Grandpa jumps out of the truck, yelling for the women to get the hell in. He unloads a couple of shots in the general vicinity of the animal. They haul ass down the dirt road towards Grandma's house. My aunt, against her better judgment, looks back and sees red eyes watching them. The next day, my grandpa and uncle head over to the house. Grandpa verified that all around the house there were bare footprints in the sand, along with very large coyote tracks. Needless to say, my aunt and grandma never went back to that house. My aunt won't even talk about it. I made the mistake of staying up too late and listening to the adults talk. My aunt moved in with my grandparents. My grandma swears, though, that she would see those red eyes at night stalking the edge of her property. As far as I know, other people have tried living in the Stollards' house, but leave within a month or two. That whole area is cursed. I always hated going out there. It's an oppressive, evil feeling, even at my grandparents'. I have more stories about that cursed land involving other family members, but they will have to wait for another time. After researching and talking to my Native American friends, I'm fairly certain that what my family members had the misfortune of running into was a skinwalker. According to the Native Americans in the area, they frequent burials and graveyards, looting and desecrating the sites. They take pieces of brains and bodies and grind them into a corpse powder to use in their curses. They are also known to terrorize people away from areas like burials and ruins. Story 6. Okay, so I know skinwalkers are incredibly cliched. You know, with all those green text stories, it's a surprise that skinwalkers are still considered a myth despite the fact that everyone and their mother have encountered one. I'm only saying this as a skinwalker experience because I can't think of another creature that fits the description. So, here we go. A while ago, when I was in early high school, I was left alone at home for some reason. I can't remember the reason, but I was left home alone a lot during my teenage years. So a little info on my house is that although I don't live in a rural area, I certainly wouldn't call the area civilized. There are barns within walking distance of my house. I guess the area is developing because there are also subdivisions around. Also, my house has a sliding glass door that leads onto a deck in the back. My family has a special knock that we use, so whoever's inside knows that it's one of us. This knock didn't sound like one my family would use, so I just ignored it because I didn't want to deal with some stranger at the door. Whoever it was knocked again in a more familiar pattern, so I reluctantly went to the door. When I got there, I didn't notice anyone out front. I figured that whoever it was just left because I took my sweet time getting to the door. Then I guess I heard a sound or something coming from the back sliding glass door. Another thing members of my family do is if no one answers the door, they'll try to find another way in, such as the back door. So I went to the back door and didn't notice anyone outside. I slightly opened the sliding door and heard a voice. It sounded like my mother coming from underneath a deck, I guess. I only say this because I definitely heard that voice, but my mother wasn't in view of me. I can't exactly remember what the voice said, but it was something like, "Open the door," and then it said my name. Now, I'm a super paranoid guy, and I know my mum wouldn't be hiding if she wanted to come inside. So I shut the door, pulled the blinds over, and went to my room. Hours later, and my mum actually shows up, and I tell her what happened. She confirmed that she was not at the house earlier, and did not try to get me to open the back door. So for years, I really didn't know what to make of this experience. It was a very minor thing, but it spooked the hell out of me. I say this was probably a skinwalker because I don't know any other paranormal entities that would mimic a person's voice to try to get inside your house. Thank you for watching and/or listening to this video. If you enjoyed my narration, please help my channel to grow and help me creating more videos like this by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. If you happen to have a story you would like me to share on this channel, please reach out to me at mrsinisterstories@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching. These following stories have been taken from the subreddit No Sleep. Story 1. I'm an animal control officer for a rural county. I cover an area that has isolated communities of people who don't trust outsiders. I say this because after this call, I couldn't get anyone to talk to me. In dealing with these communities, I have had some rather strange calls. One such call was made by a woman whose family had moved into one of these places. She and her husband were doctors, and since rural doctors are hard to come by, her and her husband wanted to fill that need. For the two of them, though, it was a bit of a culture shock. A problem that the doctors ran into was a number of animals that were allowed to run loose. This triggered several calls from the woman to me about aggressive dogs. There wasn't much I could do about the dogs because every time I showed up, the dogs had been hidden. The last call I received from her would also be one of the most terrifying calls. I was called once again about an aggressive animal, but this time she wasn't sure if it was a dog or not. She'd made a house call to a family that lived at the end of a long dirt road. When she got there, everything was normal as much as it could be under such circumstances. It was when she stepped into the house that things got weird. She told me that while she was doing a checkup on the children, she heard a growling noise coming from behind a wall. When she asked the family about it, they quickly escorted her out of the house. She called me when she got home because she thought it might have been a mountain lion or some other big cat. I was skeptical because our area is known for bears, and no mountain lions have been spotted in years. I didn't tell her this, though, because she sounded upset enough. I told her I'd check it out regardless, and when she gave me the address, we said our goodbyes. I looked up the address and saw that it would take me at least 2 hours to get there. This house was located in one of the remotest parts of the county. I planned for a morning drive so that I would get there before it got too hot. We were heading into summer, and I'm a big man that doesn't handle heat very well. I hate having to hike through the forest when it's hot out, and because of where this place was located, I wouldn't be able to drive up to the house. Bright and early the next morning, I loaded up my truck and headed out. I stopped by the gas station for some coffee and gas. With that done, I headed out of town on my way to the middle of nowhere. It was a nice drive, and I got to the dirt road about 30 minutes early. Since it was still early, I stopped to stretch my legs and use the bathroom. I was surrounded by forest with the closest house over a mile away, so I wasn't worried about being caught with my pants down. With that need taken care of, I used some hand sanitizer and headed out again. The doctor had warned me that the road was poorly maintained, and I knew immediately that she hadn't been exaggerating. The first pothole I hit, I thought I was going to tear off my front tire. I slowed down further until I was going about 2 miles an hour. Even going at that speed, I felt like I was in a paint-shaking machine. By the time I got to the end of the road, my teeth were rattling. I gratefully stopped when I reached the end and sat for a minute waiting for my insides to settle back where they were supposed to be. Then I grabbed my gear and stepped out of my truck. I'd brought some water, a gun, and a tranquilizer. If there was a wild animal, I didn't know how I was going to catch it by myself. The hope was that it was another false call, and I didn't have to worry about it. Right now, though, my biggest concern was getting to the house without getting lost. I looked around, and like when I stopped for a break, all I could see was trees. Other than that, there was something that felt off about the forest surrounding me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and regardless of how warm it was, a shiver crawled its way down my back. I frowned at the feeling. In my line of work, listening to your instincts could save your life, and I almost got back into my truck and left. I took a deep breath and shook the feeling off. There was no reason for my panic, and I told myself I was being ridiculous. I made my way to the faint trail I could see between some trees. Once I was there, I set my GPS so that I could find my way back to the truck. With that taken care of, I started on my walk. The doctor had told me the house was a half a mile from the end of the dirt road. As I walked down the path, I became aware of the lack of sound. Usually, I would hear birds, bugs, or animals moving through the underbush. Now, there was nothing to hear except my footsteps. I kept looking around me, hoping to spot any sign of life, but I was out of luck. All I could see was the sun shining down through the trees, and I could feel the temperature rising as the morning wore on. Then as I got closer to the house, I could hear the sound of children playing and animals calling out. I felt myself sag in relief at the sounds of life after such a quiet walk. The relief didn't last long, though, because as I pushed through the trees into a clearing, I saw that there was no one there. I froze and looked around. I could see paddocks and an old barn that looked like it was about to fall. A way off from that, I saw the house in question. It was dilapidated, much like the barn. It looked like a stiff breeze was all it needed to bring it down. By now, I was starting to wonder if I'd been sent on a wild goose chase. This looked nothing like what the doctor had described. I swallowed and forced my feet to move. "This is animal control. Is there anyone home?" I called out as I moved further into the clearing. The silence was my only answer. I moved closer to the paddock, and I jumped back with a small cry. Laying in the paddock was a freshly dead cow. But not just any cow. This one had 3 massive claw marks down its side. On top of that, its eyes were bulging out along with its tongue. The cow looked like it had been choked and clawed to pieces. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't think of anyone strong enough to choke out a cow. I left the paddock and turned back toward the house. I decided I would leave the barn because it looked too dangerous for me to go into. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called out again. I knew if I was smart, I would turn tail and run. I couldn't leave without making sure someone didn't need my help, though. With the damage to the cow, I was worried about what had happened to the family that lived here. If, in fact, anyone lived here at all. I reached the rotting front porch, and I stopped before climbing the stairs. The front door was hanging on by one hinge, and the windows were broken. It looked like no one had been here in many years. "Hello? This is animal control. Is anyone home?" I called out for the 3rd time. Of course, I didn't get an answer, and I was about to call off the search. Before I could turn around, I heard a faint cry like that of a child. "Is someone there?" I hollered as I cautiously climbed the stairs. I heard the sound again, and it sounded like it was getting closer. I poured out my flashlight and shone the light in through the open doorway. All I could see was debris from the forest and a thick layer of dust on the floor. I stepped closer to the door, and the porch let out an alarming creak. I froze, but the door held. By now, I was calling myself an idiot for not leaving already. The cry came again, so I forced myself to step through the door. Inside, it looked like the family had simply disappeared. Everything was still in its place. In the corner of the room, there was even a dinner setting on the dining table. The air in the house smelled of decay and mold. As I walked deeper into the room, it was completely quiet in the house now. All that I could hear was my increasing heart rate and the air moving in and out of my lungs. This quiet didn't sound natural to me, and my uneasiness was growing. I decided that now would be a good time to pull out my gun. If something tried to grab me, I hoped I would be fast enough to defend myself. Watching where I stepped, I moved farther into the house, trying to find the source of the original noise. The house had only one story. The kitchen, dining room, and the living room took up one half of the house. I stopped outside of the kitchen door and glanced in to see if anything was waiting for me. The kitchen was like the rest of the house, with the remains of supper sitting on the stove. I didn't go into the room because there was a hole in the middle. Moving on, I found the first bedroom across from the kitchen. From the decorations in this room, it was a child's room. Not seeing anything of interest, I moved past the next kid's room to the largest bedroom at the end of the hall. I stepped into this room, and the first thing I saw was blood smeared across the wall behind the bed. It was in the shape of large claw marks, and I tensed at the second sign of violence. I looked around the room, and my eyes slid across a shadow. When it struck me that something was there, I brought the flashlight up, hoping that I was seeing things. No luck, because sitting in the corner was an animal I'd never seen before. It was as tall as me sitting down, and on each of its front feet were 3 massive claws. The muscles of the front legs looked strong enough to strangle a hippo, much less a cow. The creature gave a low cry, and I went cold. It sounded like a child crying. I started backing toward the door, and the creature stood up. I could see instantly I was right about its size. I watched in horror as it opened its mouth and started panting. It had rows of massive teeth, and even from where I was, the smell was horrible. Its back legs were as muscled as its front legs, and I wondered how I could outrun this thing if I had to do so. I took another step back, and the creature stepped forward. It felt like some kind of strange dance as I walked backward and the creature matched my steps. I brought my gun up and leveled it on the creature. It hadn't made any threatening move toward me beside playing follow the leader. I had a feeling, though, that it was waiting for me to let down my guard. At the side of the gun, the creature lunged for me, and I quickly fired off 2 shots. The creature fell back with a deafening roar. I used this opportunity to turn and run, not taking time to find out where I hit the creature. I knew I had wounded it, so I was hoping it was enough for me to get away. As I ran toward the front door, I prayed to every god I can think of that the floors would hold. Somehow, I made it to the front door, and from behind me, I could hear the creature trying to get up. It was making these awful whimpering and crying noises. It sounded so much like a child in extreme pain that I almost turned back. I called myself an idiot and took off running again. That day, I found my inner track star and I ran as hard as I could to the safety of the trees. I was hoping that I had enough of a head start. I was also hoping that the creature didn't have a good sense of smell, because when a man my size sweats, everyone within 100 feet can smell me. I found a place to hide, and I waited anxiously for the creature to find me. After 10 minutes, I grew tired of hiding. I clutched my gun in my right hand and cautiously stepped out of my hiding place. I looked around, but the coast was clear. I started toward my truck, expecting to be attacked at any moment. As I walked, I could have sworn that there was something behind me. Every time I checked, though, there was nothing there. I still jumped at every sound, and I was constantly checking behind me. Although it had been quiet when I first walked down this path, now it sounded like every branch in the forest was cracking. Somehow I made it to my truck unmolested. When I stopped to catch my breath near my truck, I saw to my horror that there were 3 long claw marks down the side of the driver's door. I quickly fumbled my keys out of my pocket, something I knew I should have done already, I know. I managed to get the door open without dropping the keys. Once the door was opened, I scrambled inside. I was desperate for some water, but before I could reach for my thermos, I saw movement. I looked up and saw the creature was watching me. I swallowed a scream at the sight. I felt the creature was playing with me. It started moving toward me, and I frantically turned the truck on. I jerked it into reverse and made the fastest turnaround I've ever done in my life. As I started forward, I saw the creature stop. This last thing I saw in my rearview mirror was an elderly man with 2 bullet holes in his chest. I almost ran into a tree at the sight, but I wasn't stopping to ask questions. I made it back home in record time. I ran into my house and placed a call to the doctor that had sent me out to that house. I desperately wanted answers, and she was the only one to have them. Instead of the woman doctor, a confused elderly woman answered the phone. I asked for the doctor, and the elderly woman told me that she'd lived in her house for 50 years. She also told me that the phone number I called had been hers for the past 20 years. I apologized for bothering her and hung up the phone. I was now confused and terrified. I made some more calls, but everyone I talked to said they didn't know who I was talking about. I don't know who I had been talking to, but it wasn't a doctor wanting to help some unfortunate people. I never went back to that house. Some instinct was telling me that was why the creature had let me go. It wanted me to bring more people to investigate. Therefore, that would be more food for him. I had no intention of doing that. For one, who would believe me? And two, I may be a bit stubborn, but I'm not stupid. I had gotten away once, but I doubt I would get away again. I've since left that job, and all I've been able to figure out was that creature could be related to a Wendigo. I'm probably wrong though, because the only similarity I could find between the two was the eating of people. So that's the story of my most terrifying call, and the reason I left a fairly easy job. For me, no job is worth getting eaten by some mystical creature. Story 2. No names or locations will be mentioned for protection and safety reasons. My name isn't really important, but what I say here may be very important. And all you need to know is that I am a resident of a rural community in an, as of late, isolated county. I've had my suspicions, and I've been observing and documenting the happenings of my town from my cabin. These are my findings. Let me lay some cards on the table with a stupid question. Is anyone here familiar with the Sasquatch? Whether you believe or not, numerous people all over the world have claimed to have seen these creatures, or similar creatures. Big, hairy humanoids living out in the woods and/or mountains. Just about every continent has its own variation or myth of these things. I became a researcher, or at least reading up on others' research, on account of the increase of sightings in my county or region. It started about a month ago when our local rangers noticed a significant decrease in the deer and elk population and an increase of their half-eaten bodies cluttering the region. Naturally, we assumed it was bears, but if you're reading this now, you can probably guess that it wasn't the case. Rangers and hunting parties started to plan a culling or hunt to deal with what we thought was at least one super aggressive bear. Normally, they wouldn't let mere hunters on the reserve, but in this case, several farmers found these carcasses on their fields. One was found in a barnyard. In retrospect, we should have noted that among the animal carcasses found, all of them had their faces eaten. We didn't think much of it. The local suspicions of a bear was seemingly confirmed when the 4-year-old son of one of the local farmers spotted what he called the bear man climbing over a fence in his family's field. The man part we naturally dismissed, writing it off as the over-imaginative exaggerations of a child. As part of the hunting expedition, many have set up trail cams along the borders of the forest and fields, hoping to pinpoint the animal. Or should we say, animals. There were different sightings taking place at different locations at or around the same time. And despite our first glances, these animals were not bears. They had the face, hair and build you expect to see on a bear, but their actual body was humanoid in shape when they stood upright. You can tell when it's a bear walking on its hind legs, and what the camera caught was a clear, human-like structure. As you can imagine, there was a bit of a spectacle when these trail cam images were leaked to the town. At first, rangers only let the farmers and hunters know, but one of the farmers wanted some attention, so they tried to leak it to the media. Pretty soon, the town was up in arms about it. Some citizens were ecstatic, others afraid, others skeptical that Bigfoot has made this region his home. Some wanted the hunting to cease, maybe capitalize on the Sasquatch sightings that had been pouring in. The less enthusiastic and more rational insisted that the hunting continue, rationalizing that these were in fact bears and that camera tricks and perception issues were involved. Others thought the whistleblower must have photoshopped the images to play attention hog, and rangers insisted that these were mere bears and it was voted up that they needed to be culled or driven away for the townspeople's safety. Before the following, there hasn't been any confirmed aggressive behaviour from these things. One weekend, a family made their stay at their vacation home, a cabin, from their usual lives in the city. They came by every year during the summer, certain holidays and other special occasions to revisit their family living in the area. Not one day into their vacation, the mother took her 2 young children for a walk on a trail. She was warned to stay on the trail so as to avoid hunters. It wasn't long before her little girl pointed to get her mother to look at the monkey people that had been following them. There was 2, and the mother insisted they keep their distance from this wild family. The little girl began yelling and waving at the animals who were staring at them from several dozen yards away. Eventually, one started advancing towards them, huffing and puffing and growling at them, and the mother hastily took her children back to the cabin. They left the next day, which is a good thing, because the day after they left, their cabin was ransacked. Once again, blamed on by the bears. Unfortunately, that was the more passive of incidents. You'd probably roll your eyes when you hear the story of a kid waking up his parents in the middle of the night, crying about some kind of man with no face in the trees outside his window. I rolled my eyes too before I read the rest of the report. But what the report says is no laughing matter. There was in fact a man's dead body hanging in the trees in front of the child's window, and said face was chewed off. The body was identified as a local shopkeeper whose family lived just out of the outskirts of town. He wasn't labelled missing, but his sister, whom he lived with, mentioned how he hadn't come home the night before, and she wanted to wait until morning before she pestered the police about it. Her brother's car was found shortly after, pulled off the side of a road in a forest area on a highway, not a quarter mile away from their home. It was here we decided that this animal, or animals as it were in fact a danger to humans. They had to be hunted, and they had to be killed. But that was easier said than done. You can count how many times someone tried to hunt what they've said was Bigfoot. How many have been a success? These things have evaded hunters for centuries, and it's not like it was going to stop that night. What they did find was what they thought was an oddly placed beaver dam, placed in the deepest parts of the woods, where hikers, rangers and hunters alike generally don't go. There was a pungent smell in the air, and when they investigated the oddity of mud and logs, there were at least 17 bodies, human and animal alike. All of them were half-eaten, but the constant being that the beast that had been eating them had had a special affinity for their faces. Only 4 bodies have been identified, missing persons from 7 months back. The rest couldn't be accounted for, but there have been a series of missing persons in the outer forests that extend well beyond the county's borders. None of these creatures have been found, but we did find a series of large human-like footprints leading away from the territory and towards the town. That, and dozens more of these dams, and upon further investigation we could infer that these were not homes to these creatures, but more or less fridges to store their meals. Now comes the part where I give you a little folklore lesson. My research. As you may or may not know, with all these Sasquatch sightings recorded, some descriptions may vary. For the most part, people claim to see what they would call a standard Bigfoot, just a big, humanoid, man-like ape. But there are others that Sasquatch researchers categorize as types. Once in a while, people claim to see what they describe as looking more bear-like than man. The common name among Sasquatch enthusiasts of this type is the gagu, a name that derives from the name kakus. It is often described in comparison to the wendigo, which should give you an idea of what kind of animal we are dealing with. First Nations told legends of these with a description of man-eating ogre-like creatures. Not exactly the cute or cuddly-friendly Bigfoot you see in cartoons or media, right? Well, as a matter of fact, these things are described as being separated from what most people would call Sasquatch. They are closer to being bear-like than ape-like. Among the names the natives have for them was the face-eater, and of course, due to their appearance and facial structure, the bear man. When people describe the Sasquatch, specifically their heads and faces, you get something closer to a human, gorilla, or chimp-like face. The gagu has a snout, according to witnesses, to be more akin to baboon or mandrill, Some sightings have mistaken them for werewolves or dogmen. Besides appearances, these beings were different from what was considered a normal Bigfoot. When they describe Sasquatches, they describe creatures that are rarely hostile, mostly docile, omnivores that generally keep to themselves from humans. Albeit, they are still territorial. These things were famous for affinity of eating flesh, violent temperament, and will actively hunt humans. Unlike the Sasquatch, sightings of these things have increased in recent years, with most people passing them off as one and the same. In the farther north of the America-Canadian Alaskan regions, there are legends there too. There they are referred to as the Genoska, and again, often overlapped with the myth of the Wendigo. They describe how these things are nocturnal, how they'd live underground, how they were not only cunning hunters, but efficient survivors. They got the nickname the Stone Giants by adorning their fur with mud and rocks, forming makeshift armor on them. My further research from a number of sources tells me that while they are more often than not solitary hunters, they do operate as family groups and rarely, if ever, hunt together. How they function is hardly any more pleasant than what is previously described. Some of my sources tell of how these creatures practice cannibalism to their dead when they are unsuccessful in their hunting, how in colder weather they wear the hide of their kills, and some even describe how they have a tribe-like mentality. This begs the question of just how intelligent they really are. One could almost call them evil, insofar as you can call a species of animal evil. Conclusions and concerns. Which brings us to here. As with the rise of Sasquatch sightings around the world, there has also been a rise of sightings of the Gagu or Genoska, and I have more than enough reason to believe that we are getting a special rise of these creatures in my hometown. 4 days ago, schools were closed because large, dark shapes could be seen walking or standing near the forested areas just off the school grounds, separated only by a small field and a chain-linked fence. When the kids left the schools, there were 4 of them walking, standing by, watching the elementary school, and had been specifically observing the buses before disappearing back into the trees. One of the local farming families left town in a hurry last weekend when a dog ran into a barn to confront an intruder. The dog never came out, and when the farmer investigated, he almost immediately ran out, got his family into the car, and fled the property without so much as a word to the confused neighbours. Days later, said neighbours noticed a thick, pungent smell, muskier than anything that usually comes out of a barn. It was as if it was stuffed with dead and decaying bodies. The dog's remains were later found just off one of the neighbours' property, when the animals on his own farm started acting up on a disturbance. All that remained of the dog was a spine, ribs, and mandible. 2 days ago, a gas station just out of town was raided and ransacked. All of its snacks were half-eaten and discarded. The attendant said he hid in a garage when he saw 6 Sasquatch walking onto the scene while he was about to close up. He described them as carrying the remains of a cat and a raccoon. Obviously, it was not enough to satisfy their hunger, and the food at the gas station obviously wasn't helping. The only snacks that were not thrown away was the meat products, the jerky, and the hot dogs, but that was about it. One became frustrated, and they attacked the smallest in their group and dragged its remains away. The attendant should count himself lucky that the smell of gasoline and motor oil must have covered his scent. Around the same time that very night, a couple who lived just outside of town awoke to the sight of 2 of them scavenging their garbage, when one of the creatures noticed the couple through the window. As these animals began to pound on the doors and windows, the residents had to make a daring attempt out the back door. They had to lure the beast back after them and run around the other side of their house to their jeep and drive to the police station. Getting the police to believe them wasn't a problem considering the increase of sightings, but by the time they got there, the creatures were nowhere to be found. What they did find was what was left of the boyfriend's elderly mother who was in the couple's care. After these incidents, the town was afraid. Half of them wanted to leave this town for a safer place. It was decided that the hunts continue in order to deal with the threat at hand, with the aid of the police and park rangers. Some idiots thought that it was best to leave them alone and for the town to continue to capitalize off Bigfoot sightings. So the other night, about 60 hunters went into the woods, determined to put an end to the threat. There is 200 miles of unexplored forest in our parks, and places that previously hunting expeditions never reached. During that night, the forests were filled with howls, not matching the kind normally heard from wolves and coyotes, and the occasional gunshot. As far as any success rate goes, only 28 hunters walked out of the woods the next morning, the rest unaccounted for. There has been no confirmed kills among these things, nor were the bodies found of the missing hunters. Around the same time the town was being evacuated, only a select few families stayed behind. Unfortunately, a few roads were blocked by large boulders and rocks, a classic calling card of the Sasquatch, their way of setting the borders of their territory. Who is to say the Gagu or the Jinoska, or whatever you want to call them, is any different in that regard? A few people blocked out noted dark shapes observing them from the trees. Many are expecting these logs or boulders to be removed by the police in order to continue evacuation, but there's few concerns that doing so could lead to a death trap with those things watching from the woods. Now, we are considering calling in the National Guard for interference, but I have concerns of my own. It's not like they wouldn't have any reason not to believe us with the evidence we collected. Sure, they could help with the evacuation, maybe try to help in the extermination, but there lies the problem. I'm not a military artillery expert, but if the stories of the Jinoska armor are true, and considering the apparent failures of the hunters' rifles, their ammo should fare better, right? I guess it depends on what these creatures are coating their fur with, but whatever it is was able to stand the bullets of hunting rifles. The stone giants got their name for their armor and how it made them resilient. If those stories are true, the easiest solution is to start a fire, bring explosives in, etc. This would, at best, start forest fires, and at worst, turn our county into a war zone. And considering how bold these creatures are in sneaking near or into the town, I can't help but think of the worst-case scenario, such as once again taking into account the increase of Sasquatch sightings. I don't believe it to be a coincidence that these coincide with environmental changes, deforestation, pollution, natural or man-made climate change, etc. Last year, there was a chemical plant built for the next town, on the other side of the forest. Besides this acquiring a small amount of deforestation months before this whole mess started, there was a controversy of them dumping their waste in the unexplored regions of the woods, requiring more human interference to salvage what they can. But alas, the immediate environment was considered too polluted for any animal to survive off the land there. What is an animal to do when their environment is destroyed? Naturally, they migrate, search for a more hospitable environment. And unfortunately, humans have always been on their menu. I believe the increase of sightings in my county is a prelude to what's to come, considering that climate change isn't going to stop in the foreseeable future. And with more and more sightings of Sasquatch-like creatures, I fear the absolute worst-case scenario that cities will possibly be seen as a new food source. At the very least, my county may be the first of many incidents. You want to know what's ironic? The only bears we've seen in this whole ordeal were among the animal carcasses found with their faces eaten. Thank you for watching and/or listening to this video. If you enjoyed it, please go ahead and hit the like button, and let me know what you think of these stories in the comments section below. If you don't already subscribe to my channel and you really enjoy my narration, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with my content and to help my channel to grow. Thanks again for watching. Story 1. Hello, my name is Trent. What happened to me is a true story. I'm from a cattle and sheep ranch in Montana. I also have 4 saddle horses. The ranch that my cousin and I own is about 4,700 acres comprising of flat crop and hayfields stretching on both sides of the Yellowstone River. The ranch is located 11 miles northeast of the town of Savage. We also rent a ranch that's 38 miles upriver from us. That is where this incident occurred. The leased ranch is huge, comprising of over 13,000 acres. The folks that own it are multimillionaires from Oregon, who only visit it a few times per year. The ranch has very tough terrain and 3 small creeks running through it. On the very northwest corner of it, the land flattens out, and there is an old coral system. There is also a long vacant house nearby in a draw. We had leased this ranch since the mid-2000s and had no trouble until about 5 years ago. It is normal to lose a few cows in the Yellowstone breaks, but we have lost 130 since 2016. We lost 17 cows the year that my horse was killed. Around half of these cattle we were able to locate, The animals that we found were pretty eaten up by coyotes, but a few we found were not. These carcasses looked a lot like the other cattle mutations with skin around the eyes, the ears, and udder completely missing. It was highly unusual to lose this many cattle, as they were at home throughout the winter, and there are no predators in the eastern Montana that could kill a full-grown cow. All of the cattle that went missing were cows, and always between 3 and 5 years old. This event took place at the end of June last year. We had trucked the cattle to the ranch 2 weeks prior, and I was checking on them that day. Usually my cousin or his son ride with me, but they were moving the irrigation pivot that day, so I was all alone. I parked my pickup next to the corrals and unloaded my horse. This was around 9:30 a.m. My horse's name was Ace. He was a very large horse that weighed a whole ton and stood 19 hands tall. He was a quarter Percheron. Ace was not very quick or fast, but he had great endurance and you could ride him all day through the roughest country and he would not tire. It was a pretty usual day until about 1 p.m. when I saw something that just didn't belong. About a mile away, I could see an animal bounding up a hill. My initial reaction was a deer because it was about as big as one, but had the proportions more like a mountain lion. I tried to ride closer to whatever it was, but I could not find it. It was odd, but not that crazy, so I just put the thought into the back of my head. The day continued normally until I returned to my pickup and trailer. As I went to load Ace, I noticed the rear axle on the trailer had just come apart. Keep in mind that I had not used it till earlier that morning, so there was no reason for that to happen. It was getting pretty late. It was around 8, and it took an hour and a half to get back to the house, so I decided to leave Ace and the trailer there and take the pickup home. The corral fence was all right, but the gate latch had rusted shut to where you could not close it. I had a roll of barbed wire in the pickup, so I used it to secure the gate after I put Ace into it. As I drove home, I noticed a few large lights in the complete opposite direction from the corrals. They resembled a combine's lights, even though they were further apart and brighter. Also, there would be no reason for a combine to be up here. I arrived home about 10:30, without having any trouble. The next morning, my cousin, his son, and I all rode up together to fix the axle and get Ace back. When we finally got to the corrals, we saw that Ace wasn't there. The wire holding the gate shut had not been meddled with, so there was no logical way that he could have escaped. The corral had not been used in decades, so there was grass growing inside. But that day the grass was all turned up and you could see where Ace had ran around for a while. This was quite unusual as Ace was always a calm and quiet horse. We looked for him the whole day and could not find him, but we were severely limited because we were on foot. The next day, me and my cousin's son returned with a fixed trailer and 2 horses to continue the search for Ace. I also brought my dog Daisy. We split up to cover more ground, and every 2 hours we would meet up. Around 3 in the afternoon, while I was riding around the rim of a steep wooded draw, Daisy suddenly scurried down into the draw. I tied the horse I was riding, Penny, to an old cedar tree and followed Daisy down. The sides of this draw were incredibly steep, and I was struggling to make it down there on foot. For a horse as big as Ace, it would be completely impossible. As I got to the bottom, I could smell something dead, and I immediately knew it was Ace. He had not been touched by predators, but was heavily mutilated. As I looked around, I could see the skeletons of at least 3 cows, and it was obvious that this was some type of dumping ground for whatever did this. I was completely dumbfounded on what had happened. There was no way Ace could have gotten there by himself, so he must have been carefully placed there. I'd also like to mention that where he was a whole 2 miles away from the corrals. Nothing was adding up. Besides, I had just lost my favourite horse. I sadly returned to the spot where me and my cousin's son were going to meet, and we both rode back to the pickup. After talking to my cousin, we decided not to renew our lease. Our current lease will expire in 2022. My cousin's son spends a lot of time on the internet and thought that it sounded very similar to what happened at Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. For the past months, I have been studying what happened, but have been unable to come up with a definitive answer. I posted this on Reddit in the hopes that someone might make sense of it. Feel free to post this on other platforms so more people can see it and hopefully they will make sense of it. Next spring, when we bring the cows back to the leased ranch, I will take pictures and post them on Reddit. Story 2. This story was told to me by my brother. It occurred during the early 2000s. Smartphones had not been invented yet, only flip phones with sketchy cellular service. My brother was an electrician, a journeyman. He was employed in a small border town called Gallup, New Mexico. Gallup is situated on the cusp of the Navajo Nation Reservation and the area called the Checkerboard Area. Due to the fact that there are designated plots of land that are considered parts of the reservation, and the next plot of land is not, like a checkerboard. There is a large population of multiple tribes in the area such as Navajo, Pueblo, Zuni, etc. One night my brother and one of his co-workers were the only 2 employees on call, in case of emergencies. A power line goes down or something catastrophic happens like that in the middle of nowhere, outside of Gallup towards the Continental Divide. He received a call in the early morning hours shortly after 1 a.m. The co-worker had recently become the father of a newborn, but desperately needed the hours. My brother calls him and they agree to meet up at the company stockyard. My brother waits about an hour or so. His co-worker hasn't shown. It is strict company protocol to never go on jobs alone, always in pairs or more, due to the hazardous nature of high-voltage lines and electricity in general. My brother's co-worker calls him and tells him that something is wrong with the newborn and he needs to take his wife to the ER, and he'll meet up with him on site. Also another injunction. They are strictly instructed to show up to the job site in the company vehicles, which are equipped with tools required for the job and all that. My brother understands and doesn't want his co-worker to be docked pay or written up for violating company policy. Against his better judgment, he heads out alone. The job site is quite literally in the middle of nowhere, the power line spanning across the vast desert with red mesas in the far distance, in the daylight at least. At nighttime, it is pitch black in the New Mexican desert. Only dirt roads and no houses or streetlights for miles. No one could be seen along the entire horizon. He waits as long as he cares to wait for his co-worker. He figures he'll assess the damage on his own, and by the time his co-worker shows up, he'll have a solution. He suits up and begins crawling the tall wooden pole. The company truck is parked facing towards the pole. The high beams illuminated the base and subsequent foreground. He reaches the top of the pole. Some time passes as he's trying to calibrate the issue or solve the problem of the power outage. Something on the ground below him catches the corner of his peripheral. He looks down in disbelief and shock as his mind tries to make sense of what he is seeing. He described the motions of the skinwalker and said it was moving as if it was confused as to what was going on or where the driver of the truck was. From his vantage point, he could determine that the skinwalker was male, was painted with black paint and white clay. Then, on the horizon, he could see headlights. His co-worker was en route. The skinwalker also noticed this, not figuring out that my brother was up on the power line pole. As his partner approached closer, the skinwalker runs off into the dark on all fours. The rest of the trouble call was uneventful in regards to the skinwalker. Story 3. The encounter that led me to want to know more about skinwalkers. Before I begin my story, I'd like to give some background info on why I'm writing this in the first place. I personally do not believe in skinwalkers or any sort of cryptid. However, the subject fascinates the living hell out of me. The other day, on the Skinwalkers subreddit, I saw responses to a question that said, "Why do you believe in skinwalkers with my beliefs?" and gave an extremely brief overview of what led me to learn about skinwalkers. This seemed to attract some attention or curiosity, so I figured that I might as well write about it since I have nothing else to do while quarantining myself. This story takes place in a very small town called Elbert, Colorado that's very far out in the middle of nowhere. Like a grocery trip took a 45-minute drive just to get to the store. I moved out there in the summer of 2013 when I was about 11. My family lived on an 8-acre piece of property on a fairly thick pine forest, with a house just outside the very edge of it. The driveway to the house was a super crappy, super long dirt road that led out to the main street that had to be a little less than 1/8 of a mile away from the house. To this day, I think that the place was the most peaceful place I have ever gone to. The only sounds that could be heard were those of nature and our chickens, as we could not hear the rare car that would pass by. The nights there were the best part of the place, though. Because of the lack of the city lights, I was able to see every detail of the night sky down to the dimmest star. Because of the darkness, however, you weren't able to see a single thing below the horizon of the night sky. Along with that, there were several packs of coyotes that lived out there, and every night they'd all be howling at each other. With enough of them, the noise would almost sound like water. The only thing that really sucked about the property, however, was the walk we had to make to take the trash out. The garbage company would only accept cans that were brought out to the main road. We'd normally take the trash out before it got dark, but occasionally I'd forget and would have to do it at dark, which I normally didn't mind. The trip would normally be a super peaceful walk out, and we had headlamps at the ready so we could actually see where we were going in the dark. Well, the summer before I moved out, there was a night where I forgot to take out the trash during the day, and the batteries on the headlamps were dead. This meant I had to try to navigate my way down our driveway almost completely blind. I went outside and stood next to the trash cans for a minute or two staring into the darkness in order to hopefully adjust my eyes. Staring into the darkness, though, I felt like something was off. The normal coyote sound was gone, and for some reason my eyes would just not adjust to the dark. I kept staring into the abyss looking for any signs that my eyes might be adjusting, but no luck. Then, this terrible feeling tore its way into my chest. The best way I can describe it is as if the darkness, this abyss that I was staring into, was staring back at, no, into me. I was frozen with fear. I knew that I was alone out there, but something told me that if I were to walk into the darkness, I would not be returning. I continued staring, almost unable to look away from the darkness for a long time before my mum came out to check on me. Her opening the door seemed to break me out of my trance, and I ran to her and started crying. She looked at me confused and noticed that I still hadn't taken the trash out. After telling her about what I had felt, she laughed a little and gave me some encouraging words to tell me that if there was anything out there, our dogs would have surely noticed by now. She then told me to come back in 10 minutes for ice cream. I turned back around and walked back to our trash cans, shaking. I had never been so scared in my life. And what of? Nothing? I chuckled to myself, realizing the absurdity of it. When I took my eyes back off the ground, the chuckle turned back into a cry. I realized that I wasn't scared of nothing. I was terrified that there was something out there that I could not see, waiting for me to leave the light of the house lamp to attack. Then, the coyotes started, and my eyes started adjusting. Whatever might have been out there was gone, along with all my fear. The tears stopped along with most of the fear, and I was able to start dragging the trash cans down. The walk was somewhat scary, though I was able to let the sound of the coyotes distract me. By the time I got back up to my house, I felt safe again, but I could not stop thinking about that abyss. While I lived at that house, that was probably my scariest encounter. There were other scary encounters while I was there, but the only one that could even slightly relate to the other takes place at my friend's house. For the sake of privacy, I'll simply refer to this friend as D. They had a property that was about 10 minutes from mine, and we shared the same forest, with the only separation being a road in between us. We had been hanging out for a while that day playing a bunch of video games when I had the idea to go out in the dark and explore his property. He agreed, so we waited until night fell. After a few more hours of video games and dinner, it finally seemed dark enough to go out, so we did. We were wandering his 7-acre property, being pretty stupid, loud, and making half-assed attempts to try to get each other a little scared. After some time of this, we eventually wandered into a clearing, and I guess the attempt settled in for both of us. At the same time, we looked around concerned. There was something off, and it felt like we were being watched. Trying to keep a good mood and maybe trying to keep my mind off whatever was making us feel this way, I suggested we make another scary video to scare Dee's little brother. Dee laughed and agreed and pulled out his phone and started recording. We were acting like we kept seeing things in the woods. I would throw a stick when the camera was facing away, make weird grunting noises and such in order to make the video creepy. We both were having a good time. However, deep down, I felt like something was very off, and I think he did too. Then, out of nowhere, a twig snapped behind us. I automatically assumed that Dee had thrown something, but when I looked at him to confirm, he was looking at me to see if I had thrown it. Before this moment, I was trying very hard to make my voice sound as scared as possible for the video. However, as soon as I heard this, I didn't need to try anymore. We stared in the direction that the twig snap came from for a second, hoping to make out something, but to no avail. Once again, my eyes would not adjust to the darkness, except this time, instead of physically standing in the light, I was inside of the darkness. Partially for the video and partially for my sanity, I whispered, "Run." Dee nodded slightly, his face illuminated by his phone, and then we started sprinting in the direction of his house. I don't think I had run so hard in my life beforehand, but there was this feeling in my gut telling me that we weren't fast enough, that we needed to hide. Dee must have felt the same thing. He took the lead and led us to a nearby cat shed. A motion sensor light flickered on as we passed by, and we got in the shed as quickly as we could. After getting the door shut, Dee turned on his light, revealing the inside of the shed. At the time, it seemed to me like the cats were hiding from something. However, looking back on it, they were probably just sleeping in their beds in the corner of the shed. This freaked me out even more. Dee started climbing the wall of the shed and led us to an almost shelf-like structure that had a window that we could look out of. Dee sat on one side of the window, and I sat on the other, so that we were facing each other, and we could see both angles from the window. Eventually, with the light on outside and the added comfort of the roof over our head, we started to calm down and focus on the video again. As we were talking about what might have been out there, the motion sensor light turned off, dropping the outside back into the dark. We went quiet as the uneasy feeling washed over us again. To me, it didn't feel like we were being watched anymore, more like we were being looked for. We stared intently out the window looking for signs of anything, when I thought I started hearing footsteps. Having a wall between us and the steps muffled them, so I couldn't be sure what I was hearing. I asked Dee about them, and he said he heard them. However, I'm pretty sure he was saying that for the video. We went quiet again, listening. Then I heard the footsteps get slightly louder. One of the cats started rubbing up against us, which distracted us and caused us to turn around and start petting him. Because who wouldn't pet a cat? As we were petting him, the motion sensor light flickered on. I felt goosebumps crawl up my arms to my face as we slowly turned around. We looked out the window and saw nothing. Dee told me that we should get inside, and I agreed with him. We carried the cat back down to its bed and got ready to make the 50-yard sprint directly to his house. He opened the door and I shut it, and then we were in the cold, dark woods running as hard as we could from whatever turned on that light. After what felt like forever of sprinting, we finally got to Dee's front door and we rushed inside. We slammed his sliding glass door and didn't sleep until we saw the sun rising the next morning. Though these encounters were terrifying at the time, a lot of it can easily be explained by me just freaking myself out. There was nothing out there during the trash can story, and at Dee's house. We found raccoon prints the next morning outside of the cat shed. None of these things ever stopped me from loving the woods, and within a week I was certain I was just making things up myself. I continued loving the woods we lived in for the next year that we lived there, but eventually my family and I ended up moving out. My dad got a job offer in Minnesota that would improve our financial situation and not force my dad to a 2-hour commute every day. Minnesota, however, proved to be the worst place that I've lived in, at least for the first year or two. After living in such a small town and adapting to my friends in Albert so much, I found it very hard to make any friends in Minnesota. I was constantly thinking about my friends and the girlfriend I had left in Albert, and refused to work to make friends, and the people at my new school didn't seem to particularly like me. I would still talk to my Albert friends almost every night playing video games and stuff with them, which is almost the only thing that seemed to make me any sort of happy while I was there. With my mental health in the garbage and my lack of friends, my parents agreed to let me go to Albert during the summer to visit my friends. After the first visit, my mental health was way better, and I started to open up to other people in the new school as well. So, my parents agreed to make the Albert trips annual, as long as I planned them. Yeah, I have the coolest parents ever, of all time. So, every year since then, I've been visiting my friends in Albert. The most recent visit is the reason I'm writing this. Every year I would hang out with my friends who I'll call K, T, and D. Same D from the other story. Because of stupid teenage drama, they would almost never hang out together. One of my favourite things to do with them was, ironically, go squatching. Squatching is looking for Bigfoot, typically making their hypothetical calls and using other communication methods in the hopes to find one. This was simply an excuse to go yell in the forest at night for me. This most recent visit, I finally had managed to get K, T, and D to all hang out together. We had planned on making a short film that was based on these stupid videos that T and I used to make. We ended up trying to film it, but ended up with just one scene before we decided to just play video games instead. Well, one day, after dinner, the group came up with an idea to make a squatching video. K, T, and I filmed one last year, so we figured we'd do another one this year and try to make this an annual thing. We took K's little brother out with us to film for us, and we started recording our video. The sun was still up, so we had no intention of it being any sort of scary, just a funny, ironic video. We wandered around for an hour or so making crappy Australian accents and shouting for Bigfoot, when Kay had the idea that we could split up and look for Sasquatch. So we did. We each went off on our own into these woods with the cameramen following me, each making the occasional Sasquatch call and tree knock. We had some walkie-talkies with us, so we were able to tell each other when we were making a call. After some time, D, T, and I found each other and decided to meet up with Kay in a clearing. We started walking, and Kay came in over the radio saying he was about to make a call. We waited, and from the forest came the most terrifying noise I've ever heard somebody make. The best way I could describe it was that it was like a dying elephant that had a smoking problem. Then he came over the radio. "Was that you guys?" he asked. We assumed he was joking around for the video, so we joked back. "No, mate, we've pissed the Squatch off. We need to get out of here. Meet us back at your house." We ran out of the forest quickly. When we met up with Kay, he apparently had cut himself on some barbed wire. That, plus the terrifying scream we heard him make earlier, seemed to put us off hunting Sasquatch, so we decided to stop for the time being. We went inside and played Halo for hours, messing with each other and doing other stupid stuff, not mentioning what happened while squatching the rest of the night. When night had more than passed and it was around midnight, we decided to go back outside and continue squatching, this time without a camera and with a bunch of flashlights. We decided to go pretty deep into the forest before making calls, so as not to wake Kay's family and neighbours up. Eventually, we got to the point where we had split up from earlier and had decided what to do. After talking about it some, we decided to see where Kay had run off to. Then, I made the first squatch call for the night. After the call, the woods went completely silent. In my previous story, I talked about the abyss watching me. This was almost the same, except it felt as if the forest were listening to us. We laughed about it and poked fun at each other, trying to creep one another out, and started walking. Kay led us pretty deep into his woods, and eventually stopped in a small opening, showing us that this is where he had radioed us from before the call. The thing is, Kay didn't refer to the call as his. He referred to it as one of ours. This didn't register at the moment, but thinking back on it definitely gives me the creeps. After a bit more joking around, Kay decided to take us to the boundary of his property where he had cut himself. We walked in a straight line toward the fence. Then I think Kay figured we'd followed the fence to where he cut himself. As we walked deeper into the forest, though, our jokes started to die down. The silence, darkness, and this feeling started to get to us. We were starting to suspect that we were being watched. We arrived at the fence and started walking along it when Kay stopped, confused. I looked to where his flashlight was pointing, and there was the fence. However, the fence was almost dented, if that makes any sense. It looked like something had come through and simply stopped on the fence with enough weight that the fence couldn't bring itself to its natural position. I shined my flashlight into the other property and asked Kay about it. I can't remember exactly what he told me, but I think I remember him saying it was a large piece of property owned by Native Americans and had once been sacred or something like that. That was probably terribly wrong, so take that with a grain of salt. Our group looked at each other. "Let's go over it," I remember myself saying. Worst case scenario, we find whoever's property it is, and we can tell them about the broken gate. This was obviously not the worst case scenario, especially out in the country like this, but we continued anyway. After going through some more pretty heavy woods, we found a clearing. And then we found something awful. The hair on the back of our necks stood up at once, and we started hearing slight twig snaps in every which direction. This was a massive change from the previously quiet forest that we had just been walking through. We quickly shined our lights every which way, looking for anything that could be causing the fear, when Dee's light stopped on something. "Guys, do you see that?" We all shined our lights on the spot that he was looking at. I couldn't see anything at first, and I was about to say no when I made out what looked like the reflection of eyes. We each confirmed one by one, each of us starting to make out the eyes. Then, we did something stupid. We started walking towards it. Maybe this was because there were 4 of us and 1 pair of eyes, or maybe it was how luring they looked. But every step we took, the more they faded out, until we couldn't see them anymore. Then, we felt the hairs on the back of our necks stand up more than ever, as if pointing in the direction of something that did not approve of us being there. We stood back to back, making a square, as we felt the presence circling us. "Guys, let's get out of here," one of the group members said. We all nodded and waited. Then, when the time felt right, we sprinted. We all ran as fast as we could, jumping over the fallen fence through the forest until eventually I saw the house. I heard the others run by me, hidden by the forest, when suddenly I stopped. "Ryan, help!" My heart sank. I had just heard the other 3 run by me, yet this was the perfect voice of Kay calling for my help. I shoved the thought that this could be Kay out of my head. After all, I had just heard all 3 of my friends run by me. I began sprinting again, hoping to catch up with Kay. After sprinting for a minute or 2, I caught up with them, beginning to slow down, almost at the house. I caught up with Kay and was about to try to talk to him when both of us flinched backward, almost falling. Just to the right of us, there was a crashing thud of something that had just hit the ground. We quickly recovered and sprinted in toward the door, urging the others on. When we finally got back to Kay's house, we slammed the door behind us and had to just rest, panting. When we all seemed to calm down, Kay asked what the hell had happened out there. We all went around and shared what we saw. Dee said he saw the reflection of eyes and no more than what was just in the clearing. Kay said he saw the reflection of eyes in the clearing and heard the 2 thuds that freaked us both out. T said he might have seen the eyes in the clearing and some yellow-red ones as we were closing the door. I stated what I saw, but decided to leave out the voice since I wasn't, and still am not, sure I heard what I heard. We sat down and almost immediately started searching up cryptoids and looking for other stories like ours. Within half an hour, our primary theories were of a goat man, a Jersey devil, and possibly a Wendigo. Almost in response to our theories, we heard 2 ever-so-quiet footsteps on the roof. Eventually, we got to sleep, but after that, we never spoke a word of it again. Maybe a year or so later, I was trying to creep myself out when I found stories about Wendigos. These stories sounded familiar to my experience, but didn't seem to be quite right. Well, that led into a rabbit hole, and eventually I learned about skinwalkers. Since then, I've loved hearing stories about them, and I'm very fascinated with what they are and how they hunt. I've stopped believing recently, however, after rethinking my tale for like the 100th time. I'm 90% sure that what we heard and saw was just a horse that we got onto the bad side of, which is oddly common, I guess. What really spooks me out, however, is when I let the 10% wander, and I think that it might have been something paranormal. Either way, I don't understand how Kay still lives on that property. I'll be visiting him this summer, so I'll see them again. But hopefully, we won't encounter whatever we might have last time. Thank you for watching and/or listening to this video. If you enjoyed it, please show your appreciation by clicking on the like button and subscribing to my channel. Story 1. You may have heard stories about skinwalkers, Native American witches or spirits that turn into animals to cause harm. But at the lake where I spent the larger portion of my childhood summers, they went by a different name. Deerians. The story has faded to most families at the lake over time, but mine still recites it in hushed whispers around the campfire. The legend of the Deerians begins sometime in the 18th century. Settlers from Europe flocked to northern Michigan with hopes of getting a head start on the fur trade. That's when they found the lake, and at the lake there were native tribes. Most were welcoming and hospitable, others were quiet and kept to themselves, but most were kind. Most. There was one tribe, a single tribe that resided in the swamps on the western side of the lake, and they were vicious. They would attack anyone who strayed too far into the swamp, man, woman, child, settler, even the other tribes. Nobody knew why they were so aggressive. They tried to leave them alone, but the attacks added up and then followed the deaths and disappearances, and the settlers had had enough. They began to set up traps and ambushes in the swamp where they knew the tribe would be. Common hunting grounds, pathways, even the village itself, but they were all always abandoned, inhabited only by a herd of white-tailed deer. Sometimes, people never came home from the swamp. They'd go missing for days on end, but later would be found completely mangled. Most blamed wolves or a bear or a mountain lion, but upon further inspection, the only tracks that would ever be found in the area belonged to deer. But that's not the story. No, my story takes place hundreds of years after the deaths and disappearances of French settlers. I had always dismissed the stories of the Deerians as just that, stories. Tales to frighten wide-eyed children and keep them within the confines of the family property. But one evening changed all of that completely. Bald eagles are a common sight at the lake, but their nests are not easy to find. Therefore, when my cousin said he'd found a nest while he was kayaking along the river that ran through the swamp, my dad and I naturally wanted to see it. We hopped into a rickety old canoe and with what little daylight we had left, set off towards the swamp. As we approached, we noticed something. It was a doe, drinking peacefully from the water. She didn't notice us at first, but something made her look up and notice Dad and me. It was at this moment I knew something was up. White-tailed deer are another dime a dozen animal at the lake. Though if you get more than about 100 feet of one, they take off. But this deer was different. They just stood there. And as we got closer, I could tell this deer was wrong. She looked as if a child had read about deer at one time in a book, and then drew from what little they understood. I got close enough to the deer so that I could almost touch her, but then she calmly turned and walked, like a marionette, into the woods. Dad and I looked at each other, but laughed it off. It was nothing. It had to be. Just some deformed deer. We entered the river, and immediately I was hit with a wall of sound. Birds, crickets, and cicadas accompanied us on our journey, and as we turned the first bend, I heard something in the tall grass to my right. Rustling. A big animal. Perhaps that malformed deer. Dad didn't seem to notice, but I listened closely. Rustling. Then, to my surprise, a low whisper. And with a hyena-like giggle, the thing ran off into the woods. I felt uneasy. I felt watched. I wanted to tell Dad, but I was worried he'd tease me. So, we just kept paddling. Eventually, we stopped to rest. We scanned the tops of the trees for the eagle nests until we noticed something. The swamp, which had previously been bustling with life, was empty. No birds, no crickets, no cicadas, no noise at all. Until I heard another low whisper from the grass to my right, then another to my left, then giggling all around. I no longer felt watched. I felt hunted. Something splashed in the water behind me, but by the time I turned to look, all I saw was tracks of a deer. I looked at Dad, who I had never seen afraid before, and I knew he was absolutely terrified. We began to paddle for dear life, and with that the swamp roared to life. We paddled against the current as birds dive-bombed us and insects swarmed us, and the giggling, all around. We paddled for what seemed like an eternity, until suddenly, silence. Dad and I were on the open lake, safely away from the confines of the swamp. I took the time to try and calm myself down until something plunked into the water beside me. I looked and saw an arrowhead sinking slowly into the shallow water of the bay. I hesitantly turned to seek its source, and only saw a stag walking like a marionette disappear into the swamp. Story 2. This story is told from the perspective of a female. I made this account to start fresh and anew. I made this account so what I'm about to put down in this post will be taken seriously, or at least even a smidge more seriously as compared to how it would have been taken if posted by a 3-month-old Star Wars meme account. As a disclaimer, this isn't fiction. If it were, I would have slapped this in the subreddit No Sleep, or some other horror fiction sub. Everything that is about to be unraveled in this post has happened to me, and everything that is about to be unraveled in this post are the accumulated reasons that led to my ultimate retirement as a cryptid hunter. For years, I was always intrigued by the thought that something could exist just out of sight. Something teasing our simple human peripherals. I had been on many a ghost hunt, sleepless nights in some of America's most haunted hotels, afternoon picnics in abandoned limestone quarries, and endless searching for elusive secret tunnels rumoured to be snaking underneath North American cities. I was fairly seasoned by the paprika of the supernatural, but despite the rather impressive number of files I kept on what could be speculated to be undeniable spectral evidence, I remained a skeptic. I hungered for something I could see that wasn't a fleeting turquoise streamer trailing across a darkened hotel room wall. Something I could touch that wasn't a cluster of unexplained reddish streaks raking down my back in the morning. I had a hunger for something that I hadn't tasted before, and it was growing to be insatiable. My initial hunt began in 2016. I traipsed and waded through hundreds of green-on-black text forums dedicated to the potential existence of aliens, 2-page websites with sparkly click-and-drag blingies of Bigfoot himself littering the corners, and countless other corners of the web with lagging Loch Ness monster cursors that most likely embedded amateur viruses onto my laptop. But it was a simple grayscale forum board where I first found the word Skinwalker. The name itself sparked intrigue. What a deliciously horrible name. Enough to make your flesh crawl. Or walk, in this case. Puns aside, I had a nagging feeling that this was the exact creature I was seeking. The one that could prove to be a worthy hunt. On said forum board, I found mostly bump replies in the 12 or 13 pages of the thread I found to have the most promising titles. But sprinkled within were detailed accounts of Skinwalker spottings, with attached files of grainy, mostly at night roadside snapshots of what looked to be unnatural creatures that were so achingly twisted that one could not even classify them to be humanoid. I chalked it up to be jokes born screaming into this world through the modern horrors of Photoshop, and my fledgling excitement soon sunk into a ball pit of disappointment. That is until I found one reply on the thread that would eventually lead me to some of the most painfully haunting moments of my life. To attract a Skinwalker, it began, and proceeded to detail specific steps in how to attract the traditionally native spirit creature. I will not list these steps here, for the main reason that I have ultimately forgotten most of them. But in the moment, 2016 me decided to follow them. When I had fully completed the list over the span of a handful of days, I was humorously reminded of the Sea Bear episode of SpongeBob. Except, these steps were much darker than cubed cheese and hooped skirts. I went about the following days in curious anticipation of any sign of the creature, and just as I was about to throw in the towel, I was met with a miracle of a nightmare. A lucid dream, the first of its kind that I had ever experienced. It was vague, confusing, and nearly void of colour. I was in the tree line just a hop, skip, and a jump away from my house, the edge of a small forest that can be seen from the north-facing windows of my home. I stood there in the dark, but it was something but quiet. There was a deafening, head-squeezing hum emitting from the trees. This was not the familiar cacophony of Midwestern cicadas. No, this was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The closest I can come to capturing the description of the sound would be like standing in a concrete car garage in the middle of the night, without a cricket to keep you company. The kind of silence that feels like water filling your head, that stretches your eardrums to fit all of its angry loneliness. The obvious silence that reverberates through your skull, as if God had forgotten to write the dialogue for the scene. This lasted for what felt to be both a handful of minutes and a handful of days. I had completely forgotten the perception of time in the silent roar of the dreamscape. Then, as if a master hypnotist had snapped their gloved fingers, I woke up. Immediately, tears ran in runnels over my temples, soaking my hairline, and I was coated in shivers. I felt as if I had just witnessed a dream not meant for me. The next few months were absolute obsessive hell. I spent the last edges of summer driving myself insane with a constant search for new information, fresh proof of existence, until I dragged myself into the particularly bitter winter. I had a number of small, less than meaningful encounters, a common occurrence of seeing something running along the road as I drove at night. Sometimes a coyote a little too large, or perhaps a deer with an oddly fast gait. It was in the fresher days of December where things picked up. The events that led me to the end of my hunt can be boiled down to 3 distinct happenings, which will be listed in chronological order. 1. The roof. It was a late night spent scouring the internet for new leads, just like many nights before and many nights to come. As my muscles began to cramp for the night and my eyes began to dry from staring at a screen for hours on end, I decided to take a water break. I left my room to fetch a glass and greeted my housemate who sat in the open floor plan living room playing some video game I can't recall. As I stood there, drinking my second glass of water in 3 minutes, a peculiar noise heard above me nearly made me choke, what sounded to be something walking directly above me. As someone who has never believed in the legend of Santa Claus, I knew this was not some Christmas miracle. I counted 8 steps in total, and after a few moments of silence I dared to speak to my housemate. I asked her if she had heard that, and she told me to quit trying to scare her. This moment was a case of girl crying wolf, seeing that I had a track record of pranking my housemates with various degrees of spookage. This was not one of those cases, however. I denied her claim and insisted I had not produced the noise, and proceeded to suggest there was someone on our roof. Our attic is rather small and did not stretch to that part of the house, so it was not a critter caught doing the tango with the Halloween decorations. But our house is single-story, so it would only take an average painter's ladder and a strange urge for one to climb onto our roof. I suggested that I would go outside and check it out, but what my housemate said next kept me indoors. She snapped at me, with hints of fear in her voice, and simply told me not to go out. I listened and said nothing else. I went to bed and tried not to listen to the circling footsteps above me. 2. The window. It was days before Christmas, and the house was fully prepared for the holidays. We usually place our tree right in front of the window so our half-gremlin cats have a smaller chance of going fully feral and knocking it over. That year, we placed it in front of one of the 2 north-facing living room windows and set up a cat-proof perimeter wall of presents around it. Because of this setup, it was difficult to reach the window to even close the blinds, and many nights we just left the window's slats open. This night was one of these nights. It was the night before Trash Day, the spectacular weekly holiday dedicated to the magical disappearance of our bagged garbage and broken furniture. It was my turn to wheel the heavy garbage can from the backyard to the front, and the procrastinator in me waited until night to do so. Dressed in a strange ensemble of half-dress clothes and half-pajamas, I donned a coat and began to drag the can to the driveway. Halfway into my chore, a chill trickled down my spine. There was a slow but undeniable knock on the window I was passing, the one with the tree in front of it. 4 or 5 knocks broke the outdoor silence, and I turned to face it. I saw nothing but the warm, twinkling lights and perfectly shaped fake tree branches pressing against the glass. I figured it was my housemate playing a trick on me, or trying to get my attention for something, so I hurried my pace and finished the job before lightly jogging into the house's front door. I called out her name 2 or 3 times before I remembered she had left an hour before to purchase wrapping paper from the local Walmart. I locked the door and kept the lights on until she came back home. 3. The face. The nail in the coffin was hammered into our place in early January. We had just replaced the off-white metal blinds in my room with nice faux wood slats after my lovely little beasties of cats completely destroyed them. The night after we had them installed, I became paranoid that with the lights on, any average neighborhood pervert could peer in, and I had voiced this concern to my housemate. That night, she went outside to inspect as I turned the different lights on. She came back in and assured me I was safe from any peeping creeps. Shortly after, we turned in for the night and wished each other good dreams. At some point during the night, I woke up naturally, although having only slept for a few hours. As I tried to will myself back to sleep staring at the green pinpoint light of my fire alarm, I heard what almost sounded like my housemate calling my name. It wasn't quite her voice, a somewhat disturbed warble. I bottled up, ready to dart into her room to shake her awake. She suffers from sleep paralysis and often cries out my name during her fits to come help her. Then, I heard it again. Except, it wasn't coming from her room, but the other side of my window. 2 thoughts ran through my head. 1. I have never known her to sleepwalk. 2. She already inspected my blinds, so she wouldn't need to again. I walked to my window and carefully lifted one of the slats to peer out. I saw something there, inches away from my window and bent over. I saw what I can only describe to be an airbrushed Voldemort. It looked like its skin was too tight for its body, and its features confused my brain. I couldn't fully comprehend what I was looking at, and I still can't. Its face was a foot above my head, and I had to crouch at an angle to look upward through the slat to see it. It didn't look down at me, I don't think, and I slowly lowered the blind to avoid its detection. Bewildered and frightened, I had a strange feeling of familiarity for the thing, as if I had encountered it before somewhere. I couldn't place it. I quietly padded into my housemate's room and woke her. I told her there was some creep at my window, and she brought up a good point. Whoever it was would have had to have climbed through the 4.5 foot tall, 4 feet wide thorned rose bushes flush against my window. We made the plan to wait until morning and inspect the bushes for shreds of fabric or even blood that could have been left behind by what led my housemate to believe was a peeping Tom. Come morning, there was nothing, not even a chip of disturbed flowerbed mulch, no sign of anyone ever standing there. My housemate became frustrated with me, accusing me of scaring her, and it was at this point I realized I was disturbing my deeply religious and very kind housemate, someone who had never done me any harm. I knew what I had to do. I destroyed my journal that day, the one filled from cover to cover with skinwalker folklore and legends, facts and leads. I spilled everything to her, and she insisted we smudge the house with sage and sprinkle burnt sage ash in the doorframes. We opened the windows and aired the house out. We were near silent during the ritual, and to this day she refused to speak of it when I tried to bring it up. I still feel guilty for putting her in harm's way. What I believed to be a skinwalker never did fully leave. It never bothered my house or disturbed my housemate again, but every once in a while I'll see something strange in the dark as I drive late at night, an animal that is verging in the uncanny valley, or just a strange feeling prickling my neck when I look out to the woods just beyond my backyard as dawn begins to paint the world aglow. So there you have it, folks. A story I have only told to a small circle of trusted friends. Take it as you will, a cautionary tale or an adventurous challenge. But I can tell you this. My story shared with this creature is not over, and the pages will most likely find their end when I am lowered into the ground. Maybe I will find the courage to hunt for it once more, before it finds me first. Story 3. A long while back, my dad told me a story that stuck with me. I don't know whether it was told as a joke, because he tends to embellish, but he has told me some crazy stories he swears are God's honest truth. It's quite detailed, though, so he must have thought it through if it were a tall tale. Here we go. He has a friend from college who isn't quite as eccentric as does eccentric things, like giving his stake in the lucrative family business to his sister because he wanted to learn what it felt like to be poor, and then demanding it back a week later when he ran out of money after buying a horse. An actual horse. Anyway, he mellowed with time, and around 10 years after graduating, maybe 25 years ago, he contacted my dad for the first time in a few years and invited him to go to the Navajo reservation with him to look for skinwalkers. Obviously, this is a textbook white people mistake and just so extraordinarily whack, I'm surprised my dad even accepted. He is, however, an author of a few books on various paranormal activities and legends across the US, job security for him as an English professor, and decided to accept, just for the hell of it. The two met up halfway between their homes in Connecticut and California, somewhere in Colorado. My dad's friend, through what I assumed was an earlier internet version of the subreddit Skinwalkers, or perhaps a proto-Craigslist, met up with a native guy willing to take them to find a skinwalker. Massive red flag looking back, seeing as no sane Navajo man would do it. But even so, they headed down to Arizona. My grandmother, my dad's mother-in-law, lived in Scottsdale, so he thought maybe he could pay her a visit while down there. Big mistake. The native guide had a few scruples, one being that no one knew where they were going. Dad's friend happily agrees. He's rich. What's the worst that can happen to him? My dad, of course, started at this point to remember his recently married wife and dreams of starting a family, but at this point is staying at some shithole motel on or near the reservation and has nowhere else to go, since he left his car in a garage in Boulder for a favor of his friend's pimped-out Range Rover. Another scruple was that this guy, who funnily enough had the same name my dad would eventually give his son, needed some payment. And if you looked at his glassy eyes, stained teeth and uneasy gait, as well as the laws of the Navajo reservation, it was easy to guess what. My dad's friend came through on that front, though in the form of 15 bottles of aged single malt whiskey. 15 expensive bottles from his parents' collection that this arsehole drained like Four Loko in 2 days. Did I mention the Navajo dude was a hardened alcoholic? It's also worth mentioning at this point that somewhere along the line, my dad learned this dude was 19. 19! He had the looks of a 50-year-old man and the drinking habits of one too. Turns out scruple number 1 was because this guy needed to hide from his parents, who understandably wanted this kid, who had probably been swigging Jim Beam since he was 7, to come back so they could keep an eye on his raging alcoholism. Didn't work. He got piss drunk and went off with 2 older white guys in the desert for 10 days. He nearly got killed by a skinwalker. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So the 3 ditch the Range Rover in a bush somewhere and get to hiking. The kid definitely has some talents because he led the trio across the desert for a week, humping a 90-pound pack for 6 hours a day. This was because the third scruple was that the 2 needed to be prepared for extensive camping. And so they were, with plenty of their own gear, including backpacking tents and 2 firearms apiece. I have no idea how they got all this into the reservation, but they did. As the 3 are hiking on the 8th day in that godforsaken desert, they begin to get tired. Even though he's short, scrawny, and completely drunk, this kid is tiring basically at the same rate as his comrades, both over 6 foot and muscular rugby players, though admittedly getting on in their years off the field. He then, in a scene my dad described with such passion, puts his hand over his eyes, sweeps the barren landscape, and in a voice not unlike a Viking captain proclaiming some unknown land says, "Here is good enough." More than a week they spent in that trackless desert, walking probably in circles with no system of navigation, 2 meals a day, and all terribly sunburnt by then, and all for good enough. By the fire that night, they go over their weapons for the night's hunt. The kid has only one, a 1911 handgun. Might have stolen it from a cop, who knows. A few subpar bullets are all he has to fend off some eldritch monstrosity, but he seems confident enough. My dad's friend has no mean collection. For his sidearm, some old West-looking revolver that he's got all dolled up with engravings, like the Schofield in Red Dead 2, with all the gaudiest customizations. He's also packing an M1 Garand replica, complete with 30 caliber stripper clips. No idea how legally he obtained it, but he did. In that one category, though, my dad has him beat. He owns an authentic Mauser handgun that his grandfather pried from the fingers of a dead German in Belleau Wood, and only sadly stopped working a few years ago after a full century. And an absolute jewel of a weapon, an actual Winchester model 1912 pump-action shotgun with slam-fire capability. It was the same one his grandfather used on that poor German, and I'm proud to say it is in working condition to this day. Suffice to say, the three are sufficiently armed, and finally they turn to the matter at hand. The kid has kept the conversation away from all manners of skinwalker, and is finally ready to prepare. He gets all the weapons ready and rubs the guns and bullets in ash, just enough that they'll still work. He goes through a few quick tips. It won't be hunting for them. He's brought relics from other people with him, which is a big no-no, I've learned. But what about this trip wasn't? They all need to be awake and lucid, because this thing is smarter than them. And finally he stresses this: if they succeed with their task, they must never speak of it for fear of reviving this thing. As he speaks, he removes some stuff from his pack, including articles of clothing and disgustingly human hair, which he lets them know came from his dearly departed grandma. He also informs them that he may recognize the skinwalker, in which case he only needs speak its name. Finally, they load their guns and throw the detritus to a spot they can see in the firelight, while keeping their backs to the arroyo wall. The last bombshell he drops is that the thing has probably been following them for the last week, and was waiting for them to reveal their hand. All is quiet for 5 minutes, before the wind changes slightly. First comes an eerie keening noise. It doesn't change position, but fades in and out, coming from a slow direction somewhere in front of them. Slowly, they realize it's whistling. My dad and the guide both know what this means, and their eyes slowly swivel to the horizon, which is to their left, where the last streaks of the sun have faded. The ground in front of them is slowly sloping down a wall a few yards away, while that behind them is a steep wall. The canyon meanders to the right into the darkness, while its mouth is open to their left. They face north, which had some importance I can't remember, but either way, they're not worried about attack from either side or behind. Their eyes are glued north. The guide isn't nervous anymore. He's getting pissed drunk off the final bottle he's been saving for tonight in a remarkable act of self-control. Dad's friend is still kind of confused, but calm, which leaves him sitting between the other two to make sure his gun is loaded and swallow nervously. Finally, the whistling stops, and everything is still. A stench hits my dad like a wall out of the night. Death and decay are what he remembers, plus an uncanny scent he described like flesh burning hotter than the sun. A sudden laughing bursts in from the night, loud and wrong, like a parrot's impression of a human. Slowly, the laughter turns to a voice, repeating bits of conversation from the last week, things they have said during the morning, day and night, plus things my dad has heard the others say in their sleep, all in a voice like someone who knows how to say words, but has never tried, has never heard a human say them. Finally, it says their names, and then the quiet returns. The guide is silent. My dad's friend is sobbing, and the only noise my dad makes is that of the piss running down his leg. The thing jumps down from above, landing in front of the fire, and everyone shoots. The other two miss, and the streaking outlines of their rounds fade into the night. The famous Garand ping sounds before the thing has even moved, as my dad's friend shoots his final round in a panic. The kid is already out, and has clearly never shot his gun before as his grip is off and every shot was a miss. The thing my dad described as too obscene to be classified as an animal, but if it were, to be a long-legged dog that stood on its back legs, like a boxer or a pit bull, but perverted and disgusting. The thing moves closer to the fire and it looks like it's going to walk right through it. Its eyes are bottomless pits, and yet they have colour, like a sickly yellow or a gaudy brown. Its mouth moves in bizarre patterns when it speaks. The noise doesn't come from near it, but as from far away. It chants the things it said earlier, speeding up as it moves closer, interspersed with more laughter. My dad is scared, but he can still speak. Moving jerkily, he throws his Mauser at the kid, telling him to turn off the safety and shoot like hell, then yelling for his buddy to draw his own sidearm. Finally, he stands, and as the other two start blazing away and missing again, he demonstrates the remarkable slam fire capability of the Model 1912. They don't bother to stay. Navigating for the first time, they follow the stars north until they hit a road and stick out their thumbs. At 3:44 a.m. on June the 30th, 1991, 6 months before the fall of the Soviet Union, my dad climbed into the back of an old Chevy pickup and gave the guy behind the wheel all the money he had to take them straight to the nearest airport. That night, he was back in, and he has not travelled further west than South Carolina since. A while later, he reconnected with the kid. He'd actually cleaned himself up and wanted to apply to the college my dad worked at. He was, for a wonder, awarded a scholarship. Turns out, he was a hell of a poet, which was somewhat incredulous with the alcoholic redneck who had been nearly killed by an evil demon. He died of liver cancer a year ago today, 27 years and 1 month after the encounter in the desert. My dad's friend got busted for running coke for some friends in Colombia a few years ago. He was a small cog in a large operation. He probably won't be out in this lifetime. My dad still sleeps well at night and got over it after a few years of irregular therapy. His Mauser didn't do much, and he didn't shed too many tears, except for his grandfather's memory. His 1912, meanwhile, is in perfect condition. My dad isn't afraid of skinwalkers in the least anymore, because as he told me proudly, me and Black Jack got a little practice with the help of 5 or 6 slugs, and after that, I'm not worried about another one. He delivered the eulogy at my godfather's funeral. The amount that kid drank didn't do him many wonders, and even 25 years after quitting, the damage had been done. I miss Sam every day, and I'm happy he survived that brawl in the middle of nowhere to shape my father into the man he became. Looking back, that story read like an advertisement for Winchester firearms, but I'm happy I told it, and hopefully it will give you all good advice for your next skinwalker encounter. I cannot stress this enough. Use ash on your weapon. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed listening to my narration. This video was made possible by all those who kindly allowed me to narrate their stories. I always include a link in the video description, so if you want to find out more, please check out the original Reddit posts. It was also made possible by you, my viewers. Without you, I wouldn't feel compelled to find these stories, narrate them, and share them with you on YouTube. I love telling stories, and I truly believe there is great importance for storytelling in our world. It invokes the imagination and opens us up to feel a greater sense of empathy through shared human experiences. That is the reason I do what I do, and one day I hope to do it a lot more than I am currently able to. I have been working on my latest project, which is the podcast Deliver Us. It is available on iTunes and other podcast applications. I write and narrate people's paranormal experiences, so if you enjoyed this video, you will really enjoy the podcast. Currently, I'm releasing episodes bi-weekly. I hope one day I am able to release weekly episodes. Please follow the links in the video description to check it out. Finally, if you do enjoy listening to me narrate, please support me by liking this video and subscribing to my channel. If you feel in any way compelled to support me further, you can do so on my Patreon page for my podcast, or leaving me a one-time tip via my PayPal link. Thank you again for watching. So it's been a while since I've uploaded anything, and for that I do apologise. In addition to some personal things getting in the way, I've also been spending time writing content for a new podcast I intend to release on iTunes in the next couple of months. My last video was a standalone story that was submitted by a subscriber. I got some positive feedback from it because it was potentially about a skinwalker. so I decided to make this my next video, purely about skinwalkers. Story 1. A year or so ago, I left England for the summer in order to travel a bit and maybe find some work abroad for a few months. I managed to stumble across a decent paying job as a farmhand in a northwestern area of the Navajo Nation reservation in New Mexico. The farmer was looking for somebody to help him with busy work over the summer and allowed me to sleep in what I can only describe as a cabin. Basically, a big shed he had renovated in order to house whoever he had working for him at that moment in time. It was a large farmland, and the shed was situated pretty much parallel to the house across the largest field of crops. Living in this shed with me was a half-Native American boy, who was about the same age as me, named Ahiga. Apologies if I misspelt, it's been a while since I wrote or spoke his name. Anyway, I arrived at the cabin after a long and stressful journey by plane and then pretty much hitchhiking my way across the USA. I met the farmer and the boy, and they both seemed friendly enough. Everything was smooth sailing for around 2 weeks, even with the relentless heat beating down on my pale English skin. Ahiga and I became close as we were around each other 24/7. He would always tell me interesting stories of Navajo legend. He often told me of the Yi-Naldushi, skinwalkers, in detail, and he seemed very knowledgeable on the subject. He told me how he dreamed of these creatures often. It seemed like he had some kind of morbid obsession with these things. I chalked it up to horror stories and didn't really put any stock into what he was saying, although it did interest me. I've never been one to believe in or fear the supernatural. One evening, after a heavy day of work, I headed back to the cabin to shower and change. I got back to the cabin, showered, got changed, and sat down on my bed. There was no sign of Ahiga yet, which was weird because he would usually be back by now. I waved it off, and left my cabin to head into the nearest town, if you will, just to explore a bit more of the land I was staying in. I explored for a while, and found a nearby bar to drink in as I hadn't had a single drink since moving here. I left the bar around 10:30 p.m, and it was pretty much fully dark. I began to walk back to the farm. As I walked back along the windy road, I felt as if I was being watched. I walked on a bit faster and made my way across to the farm. As I walked around the farmer's house, I noticed what looked like someone carrying a bag under their arm leaving my cabin. Something felt and looked not right about this figure and its movements. I went stealth mode almost instinctively and took the long way round the field, hiding behind the fencing. I managed to get a good angle on the figure. As he stood up, the light shining from the cabin illuminated, and I saw that it was Ahiga. At first, I was relieved, but then I saw how erratically he was moving, almost with no rhythm at all. Under his arm, he clutched a dog's severed head. I felt sick to my stomach and ducked down, but managed to compose myself. I poked my head up to check once more, and he was heading off into the forest. I took this opportunity to dart for the cabin and pull my keys out to unlock the door. As I got close, I tripped and dropped my keys and thundered to the ground. I propelled myself back up and turned to see why I fell, and I saw that I had tripped over the rest of the beheaded dog. I swung around and looked towards the woods and saw Ahiga on all fours. Not like an animal, but like a person with their arms and legs bent in the wrong direction. He stared at me. It felt as if he was looking directly into my soul. He had 2 yellow glowing eyes and a confused look across his crooked face. "I am Ahiga," I think he tried to say, but the words were guttural and frothy, almost like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. I unlocked the door and bolted inside, locking it behind me and closing all the curtains and windows in the cabin. I sat awake all night, hearing noises and feeling watched somehow. I'd hear whatever it was at the door now and again, pretending to be Ahiga. It would repeat parts of the stories Ahiga had been telling me whenever we relaxed in the cabin together on previous nights. And every time it showed up, a horrific smell filled the cabin. It was so disgusting. It made me vomit a few times.
In the end, the harassment stopped and daylight began to shine through the curtains. I checked out the window and saw nothing outside. I quickly gathered all of my possessions and got the hell out of there. I flew back to England the next week after using all my farmhand money to rent a hotel room on the East Coast as far away from the place as I could. I often wonder what happened to Ahiga, but I'm also glad I didn't wait to find out. Many of you won't believe this story, but I can assure you it's 100% true, and I still think about it at night to this day. I'm still not sure what I saw, but sometimes I still feel as if I'm being watched. I think it may just be paranoia. There's no stories of these things following you across the pond. Is there?
Story 2. The following story is told from the perspective of a female. This just happened to me. I'm a bit freaked and I don't know quite what I saw. I'm hoping I can get some clarity. For context, I live in the Midwest, in a suburban area. My boyfriend also lives in a suburban area about 30 to 60 minutes away from me, depending on if I use either the interstate, highway, or city roads. That being said, I usually take the interstate there, then take the highway partway home, since the highway is only about a mile away or so from his neighborhood, and I take it all the way to the interstate. There is also another road I can take, a paved country road with one lane on each side of the road, with no streetlights. It eventually meets up with a few main streets, which are numbered roads we use where I live, and it will take you back towards the highway and city. I'm sorry for all the background about the roads, but I feel it's important, and I feel like my choice was a definite sign that the butterfly effect is always in works. On to the story. Earlier today, I went to pick up my boyfriend and we basically hung out and binge-watched a TV show I recently got him into, Broadchurch. Around 11 p.m, he says he should probably go home since he works that morning. I agree, and drive him home using the interstate with no problems. We kiss goodbye, and then I am on my way out of the neighborhood and towards the street that takes me to the main roads. If I turn right, it's a straight shot to the highway. If I turn left, I can take it down to the country road for a bit of a late-night drive. I decided to take the latter. I turn left, then turn right at the stoplight and begin to drive through the dark country night. It was nice out, so I had my windows rolled down and my music up, just letting the breeze come in. It was pretty windy, so my car was swerving a little from the wind, and you couldn't see the stars or anything because the clouds were taking over the sky, building up a storm. I thought about switching on my high beams to see better, but the road was really curvy and had a lot of hills, and I was afraid I'd accidentally blind someone coming from the opposite direction. What happened next made me glad I didn't turn them on. On the left was a small patch of woods and overgrowth. To my right were wide open empty fields, and in front of me was a hill. Toward the crest of a hill, I saw something beginning to cross the road. Something large and dark, with what looked like antlers on its head. I thought maybe at first it was a deer or even an elk, and I slowed down. But when I got closer, I realized something was wrong. One of the things that was wrong was that it was moving very slow, like it was hurt or something. And it didn't even glance at me, it just kept moving towards the patch of trees to my left, which I thought seemed weird. I felt like it should have at least acknowledged the sound of my vehicle. The second thing was that this animal that I presumed was a deer or elk, couldn't have been. It was at least the size of a moose, but that couldn't be right because where I'm from, there are no moose. We had deer and maybe some elk, but not moose. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me as I watched this moose thing make its way across the road. And then it stopped, and it looked right at me. It twisted its head so fast to look at me I almost screamed. Its face was hideous. It looked rotten somehow, like it was withering away, and its eyes were so dark, I was scared it didn't have any eyes. There was blood dripping from where its mouth was, and I could see sharp teeth poking out from its lips as they pulled back into a sneer.
I thought about reversing my car and hightailing it out of there, but I was frozen. You know how when adrenaline kicks they say you enter either fight or flight mode? Well, they don't tell you that there's a third option, and that's to freeze, which is exactly what I did. I just stayed in place, hands still on the wheel, foot still digging into the brakes. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that thing with the thing staring back at me. But when it started towards my car, I honestly thought I was going to die. I couldn't move, couldn't blink, could barely even breathe. All I could do was hope and pray that I wouldn't be killed by some freakish moose-looking monster. And then a pair of lights began to rise over the hill toward us, and as this other vehicle's high beams shone on the thing in the road, it let out this blood-curdling scream that didn't sound entirely human. It was guttural and animalistic and sort of raspy. It's hard to explain. But I watched as this thing got on its hind legs and lurched itself across the road and into the thicket of trees and bushes, narrowly missing the other person. I knew that thing would probably come back out if I stayed where I was. So before I could give it a chance, I slammed on my gas pedal and gunned it out of there, going well over the posted speed limit. I just wanted to get as far away from it as possible. Every dark curve or patch of trees or field made me feel so paranoid that I would see the creature again, and all I wanted to do was go home and never for the life of me drive on that godforsaken country road again. I made it home safe, but shaken. And to cut a long story short, my family thought I was being hysterical and had just seen a deer. But I know what I saw, and that thing wasn't a deer. It couldn't have been. I've read up on skinwalkers, but I'm not sure if that's what I saw. I mean, do they even exist out in the Midwest? I thought it was more in the Arizona-New Mexico area. Why would a skinwalker be here? Why would it come after me? Was it even a skinwalker, or was it something else entirely? Was it my mind just playing tricks on me? What was that thing? Please, if anyone knows what it was or has any idea what it was, please tell me. I'm so scared I'm going to come across that thing again, and I don't know if next time I'll be as lucky. Story 3. Somewhere, around 8 years back, 2 of us were driving in a neighborhood on the edge of a natural land. It was the time of year when things got dark early. I don't recall the exact time, but it was night and the sun was down for a while. There was a little bit of traffic still at stoplights, so it was slow moving. I was in the passenger seat and spotted a pale shape darting around, in and out of a cul-de-sac on the sidewalks. I said something along the lines of, "What the heck was that?" And the driver of the car saw it too when they had to stop for a light. We reasoned it must be a loose dog, but that was not the first impression either of us got. I'm open-minded to strange claims. My friend is generally not. The fact that they said they couldn't tell if it was a dog either stuck with me. While I can entertain the notion of Sasquatches or something, this person is very much a believer in mainstream, common consensus, reality model. This is what we saw. Creature, very pale, almost luminescent. I could not make out any fur, but this was at night. The thing was fast, and I did not get a clear enough look. The size and similar shape of a large dog, somewhere in the area of 100 pounds or more if I had to guess. Emaciated looking, lean, long body, with not much belly and weird long limbs. I don't recall seeing a tail. It was moving on all fours, constantly, rapidly darting in and out of the shadows created by the streetlights. It was a quadruped, but didn't move like I expected a dog would. Big, loping strides and odd movements. For a moment I speculated it was a female deer because of the bounding long legs, but deer have beer-barrel torsos and big ears. I would not expect a starving stray to have the energy to be moving that quickly, but it could have been in a panic. A few times it slowed down enough and was walking forward I could get a better look. It was hard to make out details on the head in the gloom, but something seemed really wrong about it. Not like a dog's head, but more like a tilted flat face with a tapered chin. I realized that is a similar profile to a dog's snout. I don't think it had ears. Very bright, glowing eyes, brighter than I have ever seen on an animal. Those staring white eyes, forward-facing, large. I can see videos and pictures of animals with eyes that glow that bright, but videos are not the same as our eyes. They perceive light differently than what video equipment will capture. I don't remember seeing eyes glow nearly that bright on a dog before in person, and usually dogs look like dogs from the front. The area, suburbs in western Washington state. There is a creek and a small strip of woods behind the cul-de-sac, and multiple trails throughout the neighborhood. There is a large cemetery about a mile away. There are multiple large parks and wilderness areas within walking distance, and interconnected lakes and streams. Usual sewer system, I assume. A bit further out are very large natural areas and forested mountains, well within roaming range for an animal that size. With regards to the aftermath of this event, I felt like this might have been some sort of omen. I can't say if it was related to anything negative that happened in my life. I just felt a little haunted emotionally, just creeped out. I thought about a dog-like creature with a human face as something I could use in my world-building and monster design. I know this is an old memory, and I could not get a closer look, but this experience was so unsettling and unusual that it stayed with me. Coming across sketches and even a possibly fake photo that were very close to my memory prompted me to come back on Reddit and post this. I get things wrong from time to time, but I don't fabricate. Now, this could have been an emaciated white stray dog with unusually glowing eyes and bizarre movements. I freely admit that. It's weird that based on seeing it, I would add a dog-like monster with a human-like face to my menagerie. It's weird that someone with a mainstream worldview agreed that something was off, and we were both creeped out. Normally, I'm not asking what was that thing years later. Considering how many mainstream lies I have uncovered, and other strange experiences I have had personally, I am inclined to believe my senses more than I am told by authorities at this point. How the world works is not a fixed dogma. That night, my senses, my instincts said that this is not a dog, that this thing is wrong and dangerous. Make of this what you will. For what it's worth, from an internet stranger, I swear these things are true to the best of my recollection. This is an old account, and I'm trying to retire from social media. We have all spread misinformation on accident. I'm not going to have possibly my last Reddit post be the first knowing lie I tell on here. My memory is not perfect, but some experiences are seared in there. Be well. Ask your own questions and find your own answers. Any of us could be wrong, including established authorities. I am still haunted by this. Thank you for watching and or listening to this video. If you enjoyed my storytelling, please go ahead and hit the like button. Please also subscribe to help my channel to grow. It really does help. Thanks again for listening. Everything I'm about to tell you is true. These are the real events that befell me and the woman that is now my wife. We never found out what it was, or why it chose us. For a long time, I didn't share my story out of fear that it would find us, and our hell would start again. Since I don't know what caused our situation, my best advice is to stay away from Grafton, North Dakota. If you look really hard and talk to the right people, there are 3 stories you'll hear about Grafton. The first and most well-known is the 13 people that died at a dinner party where some home-canned peas had been contaminated with botulism. The second, and I've only heard this from one person, though it was an eyewitness account, is that some teenagers once tried to summon the devil, but failed. Apparently, if you fail to summon the devil, you're supposed to kill yourself. One of the teenagers did it. They jumped off a school roof in a nearby town. The third story is the type of story that is passed around the halls at school. Just kids trying to creep each other out. Rumour had it that there is a web of underground tunnels that connects all the major areas and government buildings of Grafton. This includes the schools, government buildings, and the mental institution. The tunnels are supposedly there for emergency use, but we would always wonder how easy it would be for a mental patient to escape and find their way to the tunnels, and in turn, the schools. This is the fourth story. Only 2 know it in its completeness, and only 1 wishes to share it. I was moving out of my father's house. I had nothing against my father. It was just time. I'm a local boy, born in Grand Forks, spent most of my life in northeastern North Dakota. I had gone to high school in Grafton and wanted to graduate there as well, so I found a job at a local department store and got an apartment. Everything went smooth. The apartment was great. The only thing that didn't work was the AC, and it was August, so I wasn't really worried about it. It was on that first night, when I went to bed, that I noticed something odd. Now honestly, I'm a horror story buff, especially paranormal, and I love watching paranormal horror movies. I even like nightmares. Well, once they're over. So I laid down in bed, and imagine my surprise when I hear a rumble coming from the corner of the room just above the door. It sounded like someone running their fingernail across the teeth of a comb. If you've ever seen The Grudge, you know the sound. My eyes were open in a flash, and I looked at the source of the noise. A few seconds passed, and nothing happened. The sound kept going. But that's it. I wrote it off as the pipes or creaky floors. My apartment was in the basement. I actually thought it was kind of cool. It would start every night as soon as I went to bed. I fell asleep to it, almost like a lullaby. When I woke up in the morning, it was always gone. It was like this for about a week, always in the same spot, always starting just after I got in bed. Then the woman I am now married to moved in, and things began to change. Little changes at first. On the first night, the volume of the sound would fluctuate. That was new. On the second night, it began moving around the room. The bedroom door and the closet were both on the south wall. The sound moved from above the door to above the closet. Some of my wife's possessions were laying on the floor of the closet, mostly books. After we woke up that morning, she went to get one of her books and called me into the room. When I got there, I saw that all of her possessions were soaking wet. The really weird part is that the walls, ceiling, and floor were completely dry. That night, we got into bed, and it started again. The volume started to raise louder and louder, until it was all we could hear. It was so loud that the sound seemed to come from everywhere. It quieted to talking level, and began to move. It moved across the east wall and onto my wife's side of the room. It then moved along the north wall until it was in the corner above my wife's head. We decided to sleep in the living room that night. We brought our mattresses out and everything. As soon as we got in bed, we heard it start up in the bedroom again, back above the door. We never did sleep in that room again. I knew these things were odd, but I didn't think they were paranormal. I mean, animals are supposed to be sensitive to that kind of stuff, right? Well, we had 2 cats at the time, and neither of them seemed to be bothered. As I had mentioned, I was finishing up school. My wife would get antsy in the house all alone, and liked to go on walks to pass the time. She wasn't from the area, and she had never been to North Dakota before. She just figured she'd use these walks to get to know the area. Almost immediately, people would start to harass her when she went out. Children, adults, even the elderly would yell at her and call her names for no reason. These people literally knew nothing about her. It got to the point where I told her just to wait for me in the apartment, and we'd walk together at night. The first night for us to walk together arrived. We were walking along one of the 2 main roads in town, and a car drives by. It goes off, and I think nothing of it. But then, about 10 or 15 minutes later, it comes back. There are 3 guys in the car. They're probably a little older than me, and one of them yells something at my wife. I don't remember what they said, but I turned and yelled back, "Shut the fuck up, arsehole!" and gave them the middle finger as they drove off. I only mention this because I had never known anyone in this town to act like this at all, towards anyone. So to see so many acting so ignorant towards the same person was just beyond understanding. While on this walk, I told my wife what the sound in the bedroom reminded me of, and she didn't recognize it. I was surprised to learn that she had never seen The Grudge. I had what I thought was a great idea. Spoiler alert, I was wrong. On the way back home, we stopped at a local movie rental place. I think it's called Leonard's. It's also in the lobby of the town's only hotel. I'm actually a little surprised that we found the movie. They're not known for having a large selection. We get home and watch it, and throughout the movie I can hear the sound starting and stopping in our room. As the movie nears the end, the sound moves out of the bedroom and into the space between our bedroom door and the bathroom door. I'd call it a hall, but it's literally only as long as the doors are wide. That's the closest it gets that night. We continue our late-night walks, and I tell my wife a little about the town on each trip. We almost always stick to the 2 main roads. Every once in a while, we'd see or hear something that would creep us out. We'd hear footsteps walking on the sidewalk behind us, but when we'd look, there would be no one there. We'd see a house where all the lights were off, then look back and see a woman in a blue nightgown bathed in blue light. She'd be looking right at us from what appeared to be a bedroom window. Then, she'd be gone. Despite all this creepiness, we were still a young couple and decided to be adventurous. My wife and I walked to the park at the far north of town. In order to get there, we had to walk past the mental institution. If you look up Grafton on Google, it'll be labelled a state school. As we passed, I told her some stories I'd heard from my sister back when she used to work there. I remember that after we passed the institution we looked back, and I was surprised to see that right behind the institute was a graveyard, and the park we were going to was just across the street from both. We just kind of shrugged it off. I know, a lot has happened to us at this point, but we were both in denial about what was going on. That didn't last very long. We got into the park and found a spot that was secluded enough to hide us, but open enough to still feel dangerous. We laid down on the ground and did our dirty deed. As soon as it was over, I heard a loud, high-pitched noise. It sounded like one bark from a hyena. I stood up as I fixed my pants and looked around. At the source of the noise, I see a single hairless dog looking right at me. I freeze. It watches me for only a second, stands up on his back legs, and runs like a man into the trees north of the park. We head right home after that. As I had mentioned, we had cats. They were indoor-outdoor cats, so we'd let them out to explore and play regularly. One day, one of our cats was outside, and we could hear the sound of children playing through the screen in our living room. The next events happened fast. The children started laughing. We heard a cat hiss and growl. There was a loud thud against the wall, and we heard the kids run past our window, still laughing. We ran outside to check what had happened, and found nothing. When we looked where we had heard the thump, we saw orange fur stuck to the wall with blood. We looked around, but never saw those kids, and our cat never came home. After that, we never let our other cat outside. The children that we could hear but never see never left us alone. We'd hear laughter in the hall of our apartment building, and something would slam against the door. It sounded heavy and metallic, but I'd go look and see nothing. Other times, the laughter would go right by our door. Then our lights would cut out, The breaker box for the whole building was at the end of the hall. I'd go and check the box and see only our breaker was flipped. The kids only got worse. My wife and I had given up on making love in public, so we were in our living room in the middle of our romance. I don't know why, but I get the urge to look up at the living room window. A child's head is poking through the blinds into our living room. As soon as I see him, he says, "Hi," as if everything is normal. We quickly cover ourselves, and he disappears. We hear the sound of children laughing as they run away. When I go to close the window, I see that it's open, but the screen is still closed and undamaged. We had both known that something paranormal was going on for some time at this point. It's only then that we realized the laughing children might have something to do with it as well. We get to talking and decide to leave. We're going to move to Pennsylvania with her family. We still have to survive the next week in this apartment. We both smoke, and she decides to stay at home when I go to the nearest gas station to get a new pack. I don't have a car, but it's not a long walk. I get to the gas station, and I go between a storage unit that belongs to the building we live in and one that belongs to the next building over. As I get close, I see shadows appear on the side of the other unit. They're stretched across the ground and out of sight behind our units. It sounds like a group of children, laughing. As I round the corner, the shadows shrink and disappear. I see no children on the other side. I hurry to complete my errand. When I get back home with a fresh pack, my wife is frantic. When I ask her what's wrong, she tells me that the lights have been going crazy, and the noise from our room was screaming at her from everywhere. She tried to leave, but the door was stuck. It only stopped a few minutes before I came in the door. One last night before we moved, we decide to go for one final walk. We have about 4 friends with us as we leave. We only get to an open field near the hotel. It's about 300 or so feet from the apartment before something happens. We all hear it. Thinking about it now sends shivers through my body. From right behind my ear I hear a loud noise, like a fingernail slowly clicking across the teeth of a comb. We all look, but there's nothing. One of our friends says they saw something on top of the nearest building, but no one else sees it. My wife and I are scared for our lives. We're worried this thing could seriously hurt us if it gets the chance. So that night, we decide to stay up all night. The noise gives us no peace. It fills the apartment, moving freely and unrestricted to any and every room. At one point, it blares at us from every angle, and I couldn't help but think it was getting ready to attack. At this point, I just looked towards what I thought was the source of it and told it to shut the hell up. It settles down a little, but doesn't stop. The noise begins to fade when the sun rises, and we feel like we've made it. We leave the apartment and the town, never to return. A week later, we're in Pennsylvania, at my wife's parents' house. It's late, and I'm sitting in the living room. I look into the kitchen where the light is off because I hear a noise. I watch the kitchen, waiting for something. I almost give up, thinking I'm just still too on edge. Then, I see it. A severed arm moves across the floor, pulling itself forward with its fingertips. Before I can say anything, I hear my wife gasp. I look over at her and see she's looking at the kitchen. "What the heck is that?" she says. When I look back, it's gone, and nothing happens again. I haven't shared my story for so long because I was worried it would find me if I did. If I am unlucky and it does, I'll let you know. I originally thought that it was a ghost or demon. My opinion has changed. Grafton is home to a number of Native Americans. I think they like to keep outsiders out. I knew some natives had mentioned that I was bringing a non-local to live with me. I believe a skinwalker was hired to scare my wife and I, mostly my wife, out of town. Here's my explanation of the different events. The noise in the bedroom is easy. The skinwalker broke one of its victims' necks, and they didn't die right away, so that was the last sound they made. The laughing children. This skinwalker would have to be old and powerful, so perhaps some of its victims were children. It had given them positive visions, just so that it could use their laughter in another attack. The dog in the park. The primary source of my theory. Textbook skinwalker. The woman in the window. The skinwalker in human form. The wet belongings in the closet. Skinwalkers are magic users. How hard would that be for them? Finally, why neither of us died. Like I said, I have native friends, and I myself am a local, so it's possible that they had the skinwalker go easy on us because of that. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. And if you don't currently subscribe to my channel and want to hear more paranormal stories, please hit the big red subscribe button on this page. It really helps the channel to grow. This story was submitted to me by a subscriber. If you have a paranormal story that you would like me to narrate, please email it to mrsinisterstories@gmail.com. To keep up to date with my channel and everything else I'm doing, check out my Twitter account, @HorrorNarrative. Also, if you enjoy my narration and you like audiobooks, I have an audiobook on Audible, Punch, by J.R. Park. I'll put a link in the video description below. Thanks again to all of my subscribers. You're really helping the channel to grow. I really appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching.